The schoolhouse at Willow Creek. In the autumn of 1952, in a small farming community in Kansas called Willow Creek, there stood a one-room schoolhouse where Miss Eleanor Marsh had taught children for over 20 years. The white clapboard building sat at the edge of a wheat field, its small bell tower rising modestly against the endless prairie sky. Eleanor was 49 that year, unmarried, having devoted her life entirely to teaching the children of farming families scattered across the countryside. Each morning, she arrived early, sweeping the wooden floors and arranging fresh chalk beside the blackboard, preparing for the day's lessons with the same quiet dedication she had shown since her first year teaching. Children walked to school for miles around, some arriving by foot along dusty roads, others riding old horses their fathers had spared from farm work. Eleanor knew each child by name, knew their families, their struggles, their small triumphs. She taught reading and arithmetic, but also patience, kindness, and the quiet dignity of hard work. That particular autumn, the harvest had been good, and there was a sense of gentle relief throughout the community. Fathers who had worried through a dry summer now smiled more easily, and mothers sent their children to school with fuller lunch pails, sometimes including an extra biscuit or apple for Miss Marsh herself. The schoolhouse held only one room, but within its walls, children of all ages learned together, the youngest reciting simple letters while older students worked through more difficult lessons. Eleanor moved between them patiently, offering guidance where needed, encouragement where deserved, correction where necessary, always delivered with warmth. In the afternoons, when lessons concluded, children would linger outside, playing games in the schoolyard while waiting for their older siblings to finish chores that would let them walk home together. Eleanor often stayed behind at her desk, grading papers by the fading afternoon light, feeling satisfied by the small progress each child had made that day. She thought sometimes of her own childhood, growing up in this same community, attending this same schoolhouse under a different teacher. She remembered how vast the world had seemed then, and how, over the years, she had come to understand that meaning could be found not in grand adventures, but in steady, faithful devotion to small, important things. As evening approached, Eleanor walked the short distance home along a path bordered by tall grass turning golden in the autumn light. Crickets sang softly, and the sky deepened into shades of orange and purple, the kind of sunset that seemed to bless the entire prairie with quiet grace. That night, sitting by her window with a cup of tea, Eleanor reviewed the next day's lessons, feeling the familiar contentment of purposeful work. The orchard on Miller's Hill. In the autumn of 1948, in a quiet valley in Vermont, there stood an old apple orchard that had belonged to the Hutchins family for 3 generations. The trees, gnarled and silvery with age, stretched across the hillside in neat, patient rows, their branches heavy with fruit ready for harvest. Eleanor Hutchins was 62 that year, and she still rose before dawn each morning during harvest season, just as her mother had done, and her grandmother before that. The old farmhouse creaked pleasantly in the early morning stillness, its wooden floors worn smooth by decades of footsteps. She would walk out into the orchard as the sky turned soft shades of gray and lavender, carrying a woven basket that had belonged to her grandmother. The air smelled of damp earth, fallen leaves, and the sweet, faint scent of ripening apples. Mist clung low to the ground, drifting between the tree trunks like something alive and gentle. Eleanor's husband, Walter, had passed some years before, but she found comfort in the rhythm of the seasons, in work that connected her to those who came before. Her hands, though lined with age, still moved with practiced ease as she reached up to gather apples, twisting each one gently until it released from its branch. The orchard had survived many things over the years, harsh winters, a difficult war, years of drought and years of abundance. Yet each autumn, without fail, the trees produced their harvest, as though nothing in the world could disrupt this ancient, quiet promise between land and season. Eleanor's grandchildren would visit soon, driving up from the city for the weekend, eager to help with the harvest as their parents had once done. She smiled thinking of how her granddaughter loved to climb the lower branches, how her grandson insisted on carrying the heaviest baskets, though they were far too heavy for his small arms. As the morning light grew stronger, farmhands arrived to help with the larger harvest, their voices calling gently to one another across the rows, punctuated by the soft thud of apples dropping into wooden crates. The sound was familiar, comforting, a melody Eleanor had heard every autumn of her life. By afternoon, the work slowed, and Eleanor sat on the old wooden bench beneath the largest tree, the one her grandfather had planted himself back in 1901. She rested her basket beside her, watching golden light filter through the leaves, listening to birds settling into the branches for evening. The valley grew quiet as dusk approached. Smoke curled gently from the farmhouse chimney, where a fire had been lit for the evening. Eleanor gathered her basket and walked slowly back toward home, her footsteps soft against the grass, the weight of the day settling comfortably into her bones. That night, after supper, she sat by the window in her favorite chair, watching the orchard fade into darkness beneath a sky full of stars. The apples would be pressed into cider come morning. In the summer of 1936, in a small town in Ohio called Cedar Falls, there lived a blacksmith named Joseph Bennett, whose forge had stood at the edge of Main Street for nearly 40 years. The building was modest, weathered wood and stone, but inside it held the warmth of countless fires and the steady rhythm of honest work. Joseph was 58 that summer, his arms still strong despite his age, his hands calloused from decades of shaping iron and steel. Each morning, he arrived before sunrise, stoking the forge until it glowed a deep, comforting orange, filling the small building with heat and the familiar scent of burning coal. The town depended on him in quiet ways. Farmers brought broken plows and worn horseshoes. Housewives brought pots that needed mending. Children sometimes gathered by the open doorway, watching in fascination as sparks flew from his hammer, transforming raw metal into something useful and lasting. That particular summer had been difficult for many families, work was scarce, and money scarcer still. Yet Joseph never turned anyone away. If a farmer couldn't pay in coin, he accepted eggs, or vegetables, or simply a promise of future payment. He remembered what it meant to struggle, having arrived in America as a young man with little more than his father's tools and a willingness to work. In the evenings, after the forge had cooled and the tools were cleaned and hung carefully on their hooks, Joseph would walk home along the dusty road, past fields turning gold in the fading light. His wife, Ruth, would have supper waiting, and they would sit together on their porch, watching the sun set behind the distant hills. Joseph often thought about his son, who had moved to the city seeking different opportunities, working now in a factory far from the sounds of hammer and anvil. He understood the pull of progress, the promise of new machines and easier ways of living, yet something in him remained devoted to the old methods, to work done slowly and carefully by hand. The townspeople respected him deeply, not just for his skill, but for his steadiness, his reliability through good years and hard ones alike. He had shod horses for weddings and forged tools for barn raisings, had repaired wagon wheels for families heading west and ironwork for the church steeple that still stood proudly at the center of town. As the summer evening deepened into night, crickets began their gentle chorus in the tall grass, and fireflies drifted lazily above the fields. Joseph sat quietly beside Ruth, feeling the day's honest labor settle comfortably into his tired muscles, a satisfaction that came from work well done. Tomorrow would bring more of the same, the forge would glow again at dawn, and Joseph would once more take up his hammer, continuing the quiet, steady rhythm that had defined his life. Tonight, though, he simply rested, listening to the sounds of summer, feeling grateful for his small, sturdy place in the world. The lighthouse keeper's last winter. It was the winter of 1923, along the rocky coast of Maine, where the Atlantic met the land in an endless, patient conversation of waves and stone. Old Thomas Whitfield had kept the lighthouse at Pemaquid Point for 31 years. His hands, weathered like driftwood, knew every gear and lever of the great lamp above. Each evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, he would climb the 112 steps to light the beacon that guided fishermen home. That particular December was colder than most. Ice formed delicate patterns on the windows, and the wind carried stories from ships long past. Thomas moved slowly now, his joints aching with the weight of years, but his purpose remained unchanged. Somewhere out there, in the vast darkness of the ocean, sailors depended on his steady light. He thought often of his wife, Margaret, who had passed 3 winters ago. She used to sit by the window with her knitting, watching for his lamp to appear each night, a small comfort in an otherwise quiet house. Now the silence felt different, softer somehow, filled with memory rather than loneliness. The lighthouse had seen many changes. When Thomas first arrived in 1892, the lamp burned whale oil, and he had to trim the wick every few hours. Now, electricity powered the great lens, though he still preferred the old rituals of checking each mechanism by hand, as his predecessor had taught him. On this night, as snow began to fall in soft, unhurried flakes, Thomas settled into his chair by the small stove. He pulled a wool blanket over his knees, the same one Margaret had made him years before. Through the window, the beacon swept its familiar arc across the water, faithful and constant. He thought about the young assistant keeper, a boy of 19 named Samuel, who had arrived that autumn to learn the trade. Samuel was eager, full of questions about the sea and its moods, about the ships that passed and the stories they carried. Thomas found himself smiling at the memory of his own youth, equally curious, equally certain that the ocean held all the world's mysteries. The fire crackled gently, and Thomas felt his eyelids grow heavy. Outside, the lighthouse continued its patient work, sweeping light across dark water, a promise kept through generations. Fishing boats far out at sea caught glimpses of that steady beam and adjusted their course, grateful for the guidance, never knowing the old man who tended it with such quiet devotion. Thomas thought of all the nights he had spent this way, watching the light do its work, listening to the waves below the cliff. There was something deeply peaceful about routine, about knowing your purpose and fulfilling it faithfully, night after night, season after season. As the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the coastline in white silence, Thomas allowed himself to relax fully into his chair. The lighthouse would keep its watch. The Ferryman of Willow Bend. In the spring of 1931, along a wide river in Kentucky, there lived a ferryman named Henry Caldwell, who had guided travelers across the water at Willow Bend for nearly 30 years. His small wooden ferry, weathered but sturdy, had carried farmers, merchants, and families safely from one bank to the other since long before automobiles became common on the country roads. Henry was 61 that spring, his beard streaked with gray, his hands strong from decades of pulling ropes and guiding the heavy vessel against the current. Each morning, before the mist had fully lifted from the water, he would walk down to his small dock, checking the ropes and boards with the careful attention of a man who understood the river's quiet power. The town on either side of the river depended on him. Farmers needed to cross with their goods bound for market. Children crossed to attend the schoolhouse on the eastern bank. Doctors sometimes needed swift passage during emergencies, and Henry never hesitated, no matter the hour or weather. That particular spring, heavy rains had swollen the river higher than usual, and Henry worked with extra caution, reading the currents carefully, understanding when it was safe to cross and when patience was the wiser choice. He had learned this wisdom from his father, who had operated the same ferry before him, and from the river itself, which had taught him humility over the years. In the quiet hours between crossings, Henry would sit on the dock, watching herons wade through shallow water near the bank, listening to the gentle lapping of waves against wood. He often thought of his wife, who had passed some winters before, and how she used to wave to him from their small house on the hillside as he guided the ferry back and forth throughout the day. The townspeople respected him deeply, not simply for his skill, but for his unwavering reliability. Through floods and droughts, through hard winters and gentle summers, Henry remained steady, a constant presence connecting two halves of a single community separated only by water. As evening settled over the valley, Henry secured his ferry for the night, tying the ropes with practiced hands, checking each knot twice as he always did. He would walk slowly up the hillside path toward home, his lantern swaying gently, casting warm light across the darkening grass. Sitting on his porch that evening, listening to frogs calling from the riverbank, Henry felt the deep satisfaction of another day's honest work completed. Tomorrow, the river would rise with the morning mist once more, and he would return to his post, continuing the quiet, faithful rhythm that had shaped his entire life. He closed his eyes, breathing in the cool evening air, comforted by the steady sound of the river flowing nearby, patient and eternal, much like the life he had built beside its banks. In the port town of Brundisium, on the heel of Italy, a modest family lived a life shaped by the steady rhythm of ships crossing the Adriatic toward Greece and the eastern provinces. Nothing about their days was extraordinary. It followed the same familiar pattern shared by most harbor families of the era. Appius Valerius worked as a ferry coordinator, helping organize the passenger and cargo vessels that made the relatively short crossing between Brundisium and Dyrrachium on the opposite coast. It was steady, methodical work. Each departure required checking passenger counts, confirming cargo weights, and coordinating with ship captains about weather conditions before allowing vessels to leave harbor. Most crossings went smoothly. Occasionally, rough seas delayed departures for days at a time, leaving travelers waiting impatiently near the docks. His wife, Valeria, managed their household according to the harbor's shifting schedule. When crossings were delayed by weather, the town grew crowded with waiting travelers, and Valeria often found herself preparing extra food to sell informally to stranded passengers, a small but useful addition to the household's income. Their son, Quintus, age 11, spent afternoons near the docks, watching ships being loaded with both passengers and cargo bound for the eastern provinces. He had learned, simply through repeated observation, to recognize which vessels were built primarily for passengers and which carried mostly grain and other goods. It wasn't formal instruction. It was simply the ordinary scenery of growing up in a busy crossing town. In the evenings, extended families sometimes gathered nearby, and conversation naturally drifted toward harbor matters. Whether the crossing had been smooth that week, whether official couriers had passed through carrying news from Greece, or which shipping families were expanding their fleets. These weren't especially lively discussions. They were simply the familiar talk of a household connected to the empire's steady maritime traffic. Their daughter, Valeria the Younger, 13, assisted a relative who managed lodging for travelers waiting on delayed crossings, learning to keep simple records of guests and payments. It wasn't considered unusual work for a girl her age in Brundisium. Many families expected their children to eventually take on some practical role connected to the town's crossing-based economy. By the season's end, nothing dramatic had changed for Appius's family. He still coordinated ferry departures at the same docks. Valeria still adjusted household routines around unpredictable delays. Quintus still watched ships from the harbor, and young Valeria continued her quiet work keeping records for stranded travelers. Their life, steady and unremarkable, reflected something true about ordinary families throughout the Roman world, daily existence shaped not by dramatic events, but by the patient, repeated rhythm of ships crossing a narrow sea. In the ancient Roman port of Gades, on the Atlantic coast of southern Hispania, a modest family lived a life shaped by the steady rhythm of ships involved in the salted fish and garum trade. Nothing about their days was extraordinary. It followed the same familiar pattern shared by most harbor families of the era. Gnaeus Aemilius worked as a fish salting overseer, managing workers who prepared and packed salted fish into large clay containers before they were loaded onto ships bound for Rome and other Mediterranean ports. It was steady, unglamorous labor. Each batch required careful timing and consistent salting proportions, since improperly preserved fish could spoil during the long voyage east. Most days followed the same routine. Checking vats, supervising packing, and recording quantities before ships departed. His wife, Emilia, managed their household according to the fishing and shipping season. During peak months, when tuna runs brought heavy activity to the coast, Gnaeus worked longer hours, and Emilia adjusted mealtimes, keeping food ready for whenever he finally returned. Their son, Lucius, aged 10, often visited the harbor after lessons, watching workers seal large amphorae filled with garum, the fermented fish sauce prized throughout the empire. He had learned, simply through repeated observation, to recognize the difference between containers destined for Rome and those bound for smaller regional markets, based on markings stamped into the clay. It wasn't formal instruction. It was simply the ordinary scenery of growing up near a busy fish processing harbor. In the evenings, extended families sometimes gathered nearby, and conversation naturally turned toward harbor matters, whether that season's tuna catch had been strong, whether prices for garum might rise because of a delayed shipment, or which merchant families were expanding trade toward Italy. These weren't especially lively discussions. They were simply the familiar talk of a household connected to the coast's steady commerce. Their daughter, Emilia the younger, 13, assisted a relative who kept accounts for a local fish processing business, learning to record container counts and cross-check them against shipping totals. It wasn't considered unusual work for a girl her age in Gades. Many families expected their children to eventually take on some practical role connected to the region's fishing economy. By the season's end, nothing dramatic had changed for Nias's family. He still supervised salting at the same facility. Emilia still adjusted household routines around unpredictable fishing seasons. Lucia still watched containers sealed at the docks, and young Emilia continued her quiet work with the business's accounts. Their life, steady and unremarkable, reflected something true about ordinary families throughout the Roman world. Daily existence shaped not by dramatic events, but by the patient, repeated rhythm of goods moving quietly from a distant Atlantic. In the winter of 1945, in a small coastal town in Massachusetts called Port Ellis, there lived a baker named Dorothy Hale, whose small shop had warmed the hearts and stomachs of townspeople for nearly 25 years. The shop stood at the corner of Harbor Street, its windows often fogged with warmth against the cold sea air outside. Dorothy was 54 that winter, widowed 3 years earlier when her husband, a fisherman, had been lost at sea during a sudden storm. Rather than leave the town that held so many memories, she had poured her grief into her work, waking before dawn each day to fill her ovens with bread, rolls, and the cinnamon pastries the fishermen loved before heading out to sea. The bakery had become something more than a business, it was a gathering place, a source of comfort for a town whose men risked their lives daily upon unpredictable waters. Dorothy knew which fishermen preferred their bread extra crusty, which children begged their mothers for a small sweet roll on the way to school, which elderly widows simply needed someone to share a kind word over a warm cup of coffee. That particular winter had been harder than most, the war had only recently ended, and several families in town were still adjusting to the return of sons and husbands, or grieving those who never came home. Dorothy understood this grief intimately, and her kitchen became a quiet refuge where people could sit a while, warmed by ovens and gentle conversation. Each morning, the scent of fresh bread drifted along Harbor Street, mixing with salt air and the distant calls of gulls circling above fishing boats preparing to depart. Fishermen would stop briefly before dawn, exchanging quiet greetings with Dorothy as she wrapped their bread in brown paper, tucking in an extra roll for the cold morning ahead. In the afternoons, when her ovens had cooled and her shelves emptied of the day's baking, Dorothy would sit by her window, watching boats return home against the fading winter light, counting each one until she was certain all had arrived safely, an old habit she could never quite abandon. The townspeople had grown to love her not just for her baking, but for her quiet strength, her ability to carry her own sorrow while still offering warmth and comfort to others. She never spoke much of her husband, but everyone understood the tenderness with which she watched the harbor each evening. As evening settled over Port Ellis, Dorothy closed her shop, banking the ovens for the night, and walked the short distance home along the frozen harbor road. Stars emerged slowly above the water, and somewhere in the distance, a foghorn sounded softly, familiar and comforting. That night, resting in her small house near the sea, Dorothy felt the quiet satisfaction of another day spent nurturing her community. Tomorrow, her ovens would warm once more, and she would continue the steady, faithful rhythm that had carried her through grief toward gentle purpose. Near the mouth of the Orontes River, in the harbor town of Seleucia Pieria that served the great inland city of Antioch, a modest family lived a life shaped by the steady flow of ships carrying goods between Syria and Rome. Nothing about their existence was extraordinary. It followed the same predictable rhythm shared by most harbor families of the era. Decimus Julianus worked as a harbor registrar, stationed at the docks to record which ships arrived, what they carried, and where their cargo was ultimately headed. It was careful, unglamorous work. Some ships carried silk and spices arriving overland from further east before being loaded for the final sea voyage. Others carried simpler goods, pottery, glassware, dried fruit. Each required the same steady documentation, regardless of how exotic or ordinary the cargo happened to be. His wife, Julia, managed their household according to the harbor's shifting demands. During busy trading months, Decimus often worked late into the evening finishing his records, and Julia adjusted the household routine, keeping meals simple and ready whenever he finally returned. Their son, Marcus, aged 12, frequently visited the harbor after lessons, watching laborers unload crates from ships that had sailed from distant ports. He had come to recognize, simply through repeated observation, certain markings that indicated goods arriving from Alexandria versus those coming from smaller ports along the Syrian coast. It wasn't formal knowledge. It was simply the everyday scenery of growing up near a busy trading harbor. In the evenings, extended families sometimes gathered nearby, and conversation naturally turned toward harbor matters. Whether that week's shipments had cleared registration smoothly, whether prices for silk might shift because of a delayed caravan, or which merchant families were expanding trade further along the coast. These weren't especially lively discussions. They were simply the familiar talk of a household connected to the region's steady commerce. Their daughter, Julia the younger, 13, assisted a relative who managed accounts for a local trading house, learning to record cargo entries and cross-check them against harbor registrations. It wasn't considered unusual work for a girl her age in Seleucia Pieria. Many families expected their children to eventually take on some practical role connected to the harbor's constant administrative demands. By the season's end, nothing dramatic had changed for Decimus's family. He still recorded shipments at the same harbor post. Julia still adjusted household routines around unpredictable arrivals. Marcus still watched cargo unload at the docks, and young Julia continued her quiet work with the trading house's records. Their life, steady and unremarkable, reflected something true about ordinary families throughout the Roman world, daily existence shaped not by dramatic events, but by the patient. The watchmaker of Elm Street. In the autumn of 1938, in a small town in Pennsylvania called Millbrook, there lived a watchmaker named Samuel Kessler, whose narrow shop on Elm Street had repaired timepieces for the community for over 30 years. Behind his cluttered window display of clocks and pocket watches, Samuel worked each day with a jeweler's precision, his small tools spread across a worn wooden bench. Samuel was 63 that autumn, his eyesight weakening slightly with age, though his hands remained remarkably steady from decades of delicate work. He had learned the trade from his father, who had brought the craft with him from Germany many years before, teaching young Samuel patience and precision at an age when other boys were still playing in the streets outside. The townspeople brought him everything: pocket watches passed down through generations, mantel clocks that had stopped keeping proper time, delicate wristwatches belonging to soldiers recently returned from service overseas. Samuel treated each piece with equal care, understanding that behind every timepiece lay a story, a memory, a connection to someone's past. That particular autumn, business had been steady, families finally recovering from years of economic hardship, finding small comforts in repairing treasured possessions rather than replacing them entirely. Samuel appreciated this shift, understanding intimately the value of preserving something meaningful rather than discarding it. Each morning, he arrived at his shop before the town fully woke, settling into his chair by the window where morning light illuminated his workspace best. He would select his tools carefully, adjusting his magnifying lens, examining tiny gears and springs with the focused attention the work demanded, losing himself entirely in the quiet rhythm of careful repair. Children sometimes pressed their faces against his window, fascinated by the countless clocks ticking in unison, their hands moving in gentle synchronization. Samuel would occasionally invite them inside, showing them the intricate machinery within an old pocket watch, delighting in their wide-eyed wonder at such delicate craftsmanship. In the evenings, after locking his shop for the night, Samuel walked home along quiet streets lined with maple trees turning brilliant shades of orange and red. He lived alone since his wife's passing years before, finding comfort in routine, in the predictable rhythm of his work, in the satisfaction of restoring broken things to proper function. As dusk settled over Millbrook, Samuel would sit by his fireplace, reading quietly, listening to the soft ticking of clocks he kept in his own home, each one a small reminder of decades spent honoring precision and patience. That night, resting comfortably in his favorite chair, Samuel felt the quiet satisfaction of another day's meaningful work. Tomorrow, he would return to his workbench, continuing the careful, steady craft that connected him. The Quilter of Sweetwater Valley. In the summer of 1940, in a farming community in North Carolina called Sweetwater Valley, there lived a quilter named Agnes Thornton, whose small farmhouse had become known throughout the county for the beautiful patchwork quilts she stitched by hand. Her front porch, shaded by an old oak tree, served as her workshop most afternoons, where she sat surrounded by scraps of fabric collected over decades. Agnes was 57 that summer, her fingers still nimble despite years of labor, her eyes sharp enough to thread even the finest needle without spectacles. She had learned quilting from her mother, who had learned from her own mother before that, each generation passing down patterns that told stories of hardship, celebration, and quiet perseverance. The Valley families brought her their old clothing, worn shirts, faded dresses, scraps too precious to discard, and Agnes transformed these remnants into quilts that would warm beds for generations to come. Each quilt held pieces of memory within its stitching, a wedding dress here, a christening gown there, fragments of lives woven together into something lasting and beautiful. That particular summer, she was working on a wedding quilt for a young bride in the valley, carefully selecting fabric scraps from the bride's childhood dresses, arranging them into a pattern called wedding ring, a design meant to symbolize the joining of two families. Agnes worked slowly, deliberately, understanding that such a quilt would be treasured for decades, perhaps passed down to children not yet born. Neighbors often stopped by her porch in the late afternoons, sharing stories and gossip while Agnes continued her steady needlework, her hands moving with practiced rhythm even as her attention shifted between conversation and craft. She had heard every joy and sorrow the valley held, whispered confidences shared over quilting frames stretched between chairs. Her own daughters had moved away to the city, seeking different lives, yet Agnes felt no bitterness, only quiet pride, understanding that times were changing even as she continued honoring older traditions. She hoped, someday, one of her granddaughters might return to learn the craft, though she never pressed the matter, believing traditions should be embraced willingly, not forced. As evening approached, golden light filtered through the oak leaves above her porch, casting gentle shadows across her work. Agnes would fold her current project carefully, storing her needles and thread in an old wooden box that had belonged to her mother, its corners worn smooth from years of use. That night, sitting quietly in her rocking chair, Agnes felt the deep satisfaction of hands well used, of tradition faithfully continued. Tomorrow, she would return to her porch, her fabric scraps, and the patient, meaningful work of turning fragments into something whole and lasting. The Postmaster of Hollow Creek. In the spring of 1929, in a small mountain town in Tennessee called Hollow Creek, there lived a postmaster named William Pratt, who had run the town's tiny post office for nearly 22 years. The building sat at the crossroads where two dirt roads met, its wooden porch worn smooth by decades of boots stepping up to collect letters and packages from distant places. William was 56 that spring, a quiet man with kind eyes and a memory for names that seemed to hold the entire town within it. He knew which families waited anxiously for letters from sons who had moved west, which young women hoped daily for word from sweethearts working the railroads, which elderly farmers simply enjoyed the ritual of collecting their newspaper each morning. Mail arrived twice weekly by horse-drawn wagon from the county seat, and on those mornings, townspeople gathered outside the small office, exchanging news and pleasantries while waiting for William to sort through canvas bags of letters and parcels. He handled each piece with quiet respect, understanding that within these envelopes lay hopes, worries, and connections stretching far beyond the mountains surrounding their valley. That particular spring, letters had been arriving from relatives who had moved to cities seeking work during difficult economic years, and William often noticed the mixture of pride and worry on families' faces as they read news from children living unfamiliar, distant lives. He offered quiet comfort where he could, a kind word, patient listening, though mostly he simply performed his duties faithfully, understanding that steady reliability mattered most. Children loved visiting his office, fascinated by the brass mailboxes lining one wall, each with its own small combination lock. William would sometimes let them peer through the tiny window of their family's box, watching for the telltale flash of an envelope arriving, a small joy in otherwise ordinary days. In quieter afternoons, when no wagon was expected, William would sit on his porch, mending torn mailbags or organizing forms, occasionally chatting with farmers passing through on their way to nearby fields. He had never married, finding contentment instead in his connection to the entire community, in his role as a steady thread linking neighbors to the wider world. As evening settled over Hollow Creek, William would close his office, securing the heavy door, and walk the short distance to his modest home near the creek that gave the town its name. Frogs called from the water's edge, and fireflies drifted lazily through the cooling evening air. That night, resting on his porch beneath a sky full of stars, William felt the quiet satisfaction of another day's meaningful service. Tomorrow, he would return to his post, continuing the steady, faithful work of connecting Hollow Creek to the vast, unseen world beyond the mountains. The Cobbler of Marsh Street. In the winter of 1934, in a small industrial town in Massachusetts called Ashford, there lived a shoemaker named Frank Dabrowski, whose narrow shop on Marsh Street had mended and crafted shoes for the community for nearly 28 years. The shop was small and cluttered, filled with the rich scent of leather and polish, shelves lined with lasts of every size, each carved from wood and worn smooth from years of use. Frank was 59 that winter, his back slightly stooped from decades bent over his workbench, his hands strong and scarred from countless hours handling awls and needles. He had arrived from Poland as a young man, bringing with him only his father's cobbling tools and a determination to build a new life in America, learning English slowly while his hands spoke a universal language of craftsmanship. The town depended on him deeply, especially during those difficult economic years when new shoes were an unaffordable luxury for many families. Frank became known for his ability to resurrect shoes that seemed beyond repair, patching worn soles, replacing broken heels, stretching leather to accommodate growing children's feet without requiring an entirely new pair. That particular winter, work had increased considerably, mothers bringing in husbands' work boots, children's school shoes, anything that could be salvaged rather than replaced. Frank never rushed his work, understanding that each pair represented precious family resources, deserving careful attention regardless of how humble the shoes might be. Children often watched through his frosted window, mesmerized by the rhythmic tapping of his hammer, the careful way he threaded wax string through leather with practiced precision. Occasionally, he would wave them inside to warm themselves by his small stove, offering quiet company on particularly cold afternoons. In his rare quiet moments, Frank thought of his wife, who had passed some years earlier, and of his son, now grown and working in a nearby factory. He found comfort in his solitary craft, in the steady rhythm of hammer against leather, in knowing his work provided tangible comfort to neighbors facing uncertain times. As evening fell over Ashford, Frank would sweep his workbench clean, extinguish his lamp, and walk slowly home through streets dusted with fresh snow, his breath visible in the cold winter air, his thoughts settling into quiet contentment. That night, sitting beside his small stove, Frank felt the deep satisfaction of another day's honest labor. Tomorrow, he would return to his bench, continuing the patient, steady work of mending soles and spirits alike, one careful stitch at a time. The Beekeeper of Clover Hollow. In the summer of 1937, in a quiet farming valley in Kentucky called Clover Hollow, there lived a beekeeper named Martha Ellison, whose rows of wooden hives lined the hillside behind her family's farmhouse. She had tended bees for nearly 30 years, having learned the craft from her father, who kept hives long before her, back when horse-drawn wagons were the only way to carry honey to market. Martha was 55 that summer, her arms freckled from long hours in the sun, her movements calm and unhurried whenever she approached her hives, understanding that bees rewarded patience and punished haste. She wore no gloves most days, trusting the quiet understanding she had built with her bees over decades of careful, gentle handling. The valley depended on her in ways not always obvious. Farmers welcomed her bees for pollinating orchards and fields, and families throughout Clover Hollow relied on her honey, not just for sweetness, but for remedies passed down through generations, salves for burns, syrups for coughs, comfort during long winter illnesses. That particular summer had brought good rains, and clover bloomed abundantly across the hillsides, filling the air with sweetness and the steady hum of thousands of bees at work. Martha spent long mornings among her hives, checking frames heavy with golden comb, speaking softly to her bees as she worked, an old habit her father had taught her, believing bees sensed kindness and calm. In the afternoons, she extracted honey in her small barn, the air thick with sweetness, jars lining wooden shelves in neat, gleaming rows. Children from neighboring farms often visited, drawn by curiosity and the promise of a taste straight from the comb, watching wide-eyed as Martha worked without fear among gently buzzing swarms. She had never married, choosing instead a quiet life devoted to her bees and her father's land, finding deep contentment in the steady rhythm of seasons, in watching hives grow strong each spring and rest peacefully each winter. She understood loss too, having buried both parents on this same hillside, their memory woven into every hive she tended. As evening approached, golden light spread across the clover fields, and the bees' hum softened into gentle stillness as they settled inside their hives for the night. Martha would walk slowly back toward her farmhouse, her hands sticky with honey, her heart full of quiet satisfaction. That night, resting on her porch, listening to crickets replace the daytime hum of bees, Martha felt deeply connected to generations before her. Tomorrow, she would return to her hives, continuing patient work that nourished both the land and the people who depended upon it. The bridge tender of Millstone River. In the autumn of 1927, in a small town in upstate New York called Millstone, there lived a bridge tender named Arthur Kane, whose job was to operate the old iron swing bridge that spanned the river dividing the town in two. For nearly 25 years, Arthur had lived in the small keeper's house beside the bridge, responsible for opening it whenever barges or lumber boats needed passage upriver. Arthur was 60 that autumn, a solitary man by nature, content with the steady rhythm of his work in the quiet company of the river itself. He had taken the position after returning from years working the waterways as a young man, finding in this settled post the peace he had once sought on distant rivers and canals. The townspeople depended on him twice daily, once for the morning barge carrying goods to the mill upstream, and again for the evening return trip. When boats approached, Arthur would sound his bell, halt wagon traffic on the roadway, and carefully turn the great iron mechanism that swung the bridge open, allowing vessels to pass safely through the narrow channel. That particular autumn, the mill had increased its shipments, preparing for winter demand, and Arthur found his days busier than usual. He welcomed the activity, having grown fond of watching goods travel to and from the mill, understanding his small role in a larger chain that connected farmers, millers, and merchants throughout the region. Children often gathered near the bridge in the afternoons, fascinated by the great mechanism swinging slowly outward, fascinated too by Arthur's stories of his younger years navigating rivers far larger than Millstone's gentle waters. He enjoyed their company, sharing tales of distant places while never regretting his choice to settle in this quiet town. In his evenings, after securing the bridge for the night, Arthur would sit on his small porch overlooking the water, watching autumn leaves drift lazily downstream, listening to the river's steady murmur beneath fading evening light. He had never married, finding the river itself a constant, comforting companion throughout his solitary years. As darkness settled over Millstone, lanterns began appearing in farmhouse windows across the valley, and Arthur would light his own lamp, casting a warm glow against the gathering autumn chill. The bridge stood silent and still, waiting patiently for morning's first barge. That night, resting quietly in his small house, Arthur felt the deep satisfaction of purposeful, steady work. Tomorrow, the river would carry its cargo once more, and he would rise to meet it, continuing the faithful rhythm that had shaped his quiet, contented life. The Milliner of Chestnut Square. In the spring of 1925, in a small town in Ohio called Riverside, there lived a milliner named Clara Winston, whose modest hat shop faced the town square beneath a canopy of blooming chestnut trees. For nearly 18 years, Clara had crafted hats for the women of Riverside, her fingers skilled at shaping felt and straw into creations that carried both elegance and quiet practicality. Clara was 46 that spring, having taken over the shop from her aunt, who had first taught her the trade as a young girl fascinated by ribbons and feathers displayed in glass cases. She never married, choosing instead to build a life around her craft, finding satisfaction in the transformation of simple materials into something that made each customer feel truly seen. The women of Riverside trusted her completely, bringing requests for wedding hats, mourning bonnets, and everyday styles suited to church, market days, or visits to relatives in nearby towns. Clara listened carefully to each woman's story before beginning her work, understanding that a hat was never simply fabric and thread, but an expression of identity, occasion, and personal history. That particular spring, business had been steady, the town recovering slowly from difficult years, and women were beginning again to indulge in small luxuries, a new ribbon, a fresh spring bonnet, symbols of hope after harder times. Clara worked patiently at her wooden worktable near the front window, sunlight illuminating her careful stitches as passers-by paused to admire her window displays. Young girls often pressed their faces against her window glass, admiring hats decorated with silk flowers and delicate netting, dreaming of the day they might wear something so fine. Clara sometimes invited them inside, showing them scraps of ribbon and lace, delighting in their innocent wonder at such simple beauty. In quieter afternoons, she corresponded with suppliers in the city, ordering new materials, straw braids and felt in colors suited to the changing seasons. She found comfort in routine, in the rhythm of her needle moving steadily through fabric, in knowing her work brought quiet joy to women throughout her town. As evening settled over Chestnut Square, Clara would close her shutters, extinguish her lamp, and walk the short distance to her rooms above the shop, her thoughts already turning toward tomorrow's commissions and the gentle satisfaction of honest, careful work. That night, resting quietly by her window, Clara felt the deep contentment of a life devoted to beauty and craft. Tomorrow, she would return to her worktable, continuing the patient rhythm of shaping felt and ribbon into small moments of grace for the women who trusted her completely. The Lamplighter of Ashwood Lane. In the autumn of 1919, in a small town in Connecticut called Ashwood, there lived a lamplighter named George Whitmore, whose evening rounds through the town's gaslit streets had become as familiar as the changing seasons themselves. For nearly 15 years, George had walked the same route each evening, a long brass pole resting on his shoulder, lighting each lamp with practiced ease as dusk settled over the quiet streets. George was 42 that autumn, a widower with 2 grown children who had moved away seeking work in larger cities. He found purpose in his solitary evening walks, in the ritual of illuminating darkened corners, watching golden light spread gradually through town as he moved methodically from lamp to lamp along Ashwood Lane and the streets beyond. The townspeople had grown accustomed to his presence, children waving from porches as he passed, elderly residents nodding gratefully from rocking chairs, knowing his arrival meant safety for evening walks home from church socials or visits with neighbors. He knew every lamp intimately, which ones flickered unpredictably, which required careful adjustment during windy nights, which corners needed his attention first as darkness fell fastest there. That particular autumn, talk had begun circulating about electric lights arriving eventually, promising brighter streets requiring no evening rounds at all. George felt no bitterness toward this coming change, understanding progress as inevitable, though he treasured his remaining evenings walking familiar streets, greeting neighbors, watching the town settle peacefully into nightfall under his careful attention. Children sometimes followed him partway on his route, fascinated by the small flame he carried, asking questions about how gaslights worked, listening intently as he explained the simple mechanisms with patient enthusiasm. He enjoyed these moments, finding joy in sharing small knowledge with curious young minds eager to understand the world around them. In the quiet hours before beginning his rounds, George would sit on his porch, watching the sky deepen into evening colors, preparing himself mentally for the peaceful solitude of his walk. He had grown to love this transitional hour, neither fully day nor night, filled with soft light and gentle stillness before darkness fully arrived. As his final lamp flickered to life each evening, George would pause briefly, admiring the gentle glow spreading across town, feeling quiet pride in his small but meaningful contribution to his neighbors' safety and comfort. That night, walking home along streets now softly illuminated, George felt the deep satisfaction of purposeful work faithfully completed. Tomorrow evening, he would rise again to his familiar task, continuing the steady, comforting rhythm that connected him gently to his entire community. The Ice Cutter of Loon Lake. In the winter of 1922, in a small town in Minnesota called Loon Lake, there lived an ice cutter named Olaf Nystrom, whose family had harvested ice from the frozen lake for nearly 40 years. Each January, when the ice grew thick enough to bear weight, Olaf gathered his crew of neighbors and set out across the frozen surface, saws and horses ready for the season's most important work. Olaf was 51 that winter, broad-shouldered and steady, his beard often crusted with frost during the long hours spent cutting massive blocks of ice destined for iceboxes throughout the county. He had learned the trade from his father, who had arrived from Sweden decades earlier, bringing with him knowledge of harvesting ice from frozen lakes back home. The work was demanding and dangerous, requiring careful attention to the ice's thickness and strength, understanding subtle signs that separated safe harvesting from perilous risk. Olaf moved methodically across the lake each morning, testing the ice with practiced instinct before allowing his crew to begin sawing the great blocks that would be hauled to nearby icehouses, packed in sawdust to last through summer's heat. That particular winter had been especially cold, producing ice of remarkable thickness and clarity, promising a bountiful harvest that would supply the entire region generously through warmer months ahead. Olaf felt quiet satisfaction watching his sons, now grown, working alongside him, continuing traditions passed down through generations of ice cutters before them. Horses pulled heavy sledges loaded with ice blocks toward the icehouse, their breath visible in the frigid air, harnesses jingling softly against the day's rhythmic labor. Townspeople often gathered to watch the harvest, appreciating the communal effort required each winter to ensure their iceboxes remained stocked throughout summer's warmth. In the evenings, after the day's cutting concluded, Olaf and his crew would gather in the small warming house near the lake's edge, sharing coffee and simple food, exchanging stories while thawing frozen fingers before the crackling stove. He cherished these quiet moments of camaraderie, born from shared labor and mutual respect among neighbors. As darkness settled over Loon Lake, Olaf would walk home along snow-covered paths, his muscles pleasantly tired, his thoughts turning toward tomorrow's continued harvest. The lake lay silent and frozen behind him, holding within its icy depths another season's essential bounty. That night, resting beside his own warm stove, Olaf felt the deep satisfaction of demanding, meaningful work shared among trusted neighbors. Tomorrow, he would return to the frozen lake, continuing the careful, steady harvest that sustained his community through the changing seasons. The Weaver of Coldwater Mill. In the summer of 1933, in a small textile town in South Carolina called Coldwater, there lived a weaver named Ruth Calhoun, who had worked the looms at the old cotton mill for nearly 20 years. The mill stood beside a wide, slow-moving river, its brick walls weathered by decades of sun and rain, its windows often left open during summer months to catch whatever breeze the river offered. Ruth was 44 that summer, her hands quick and sure at the loom, her ears attuned to the rhythmic clatter of machinery that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. She had begun working at the mill as a girl of 16, learning the trade from older women who treated her with patient kindness, teaching her not just technique, but the quiet endurance required for a lifetime spent among spinning threads. The mill employed nearly the entire town, families depending on its steady wages through good years and lean ones alike. Ruth had raised 3 children on what she earned there, waking before dawn each day to prepare breakfast before walking the short distance to begin her shift, her days measured by the mill's steady rhythm rather than the sun's slow arc overhead. That particular summer, work had been steady, cotton prices recovering somewhat after difficult years, and Ruth felt a cautious relief shared throughout the mill village. She worked alongside women she had known her entire life, their friendships forged through shared labor, quiet conversations exchanged over the roar of machinery, support offered during illness, childbirth, and loss. During brief breaks, workers gathered near open windows, welcoming whatever breeze drifted up from the river, sharing bits of gossip and news from town, finding small moments of levity amid demanding labor. Ruth cherished these fleeting exchanges, understanding they sustained her through long hours of repetitive, exhausting work. In the evenings, walking home along dusty roads lined with modest mill houses, Ruth would pass neighbors sitting on porches, exchanging greetings, feeling the deep sense of community that bound this small town together through shared struggle and quiet resilience. As night fell over Coldwater, Ruth would sit briefly on her own porch, listening to crickets and distant voices, feeling her tired muscles slowly relax after another long day's labor. That night, resting quietly, Ruth felt the deep, weary satisfaction of honest work completed. Tomorrow, she would rise again before dawn, returning to her loom, continuing the steady rhythm that sustained both her family and the entire mill town she called home. The harbor pilot of Gull Bay. In the spring of 1928, in a small coastal town in Maine called Gull Bay, there lived a harbor pilot named Nathaniel Foss, whose knowledge of the treacherous waters surrounding the bay had guided countless ships safely to port for nearly 30 years. His small boat, weathered but reliable, carried him out each morning to meet incoming vessels, offering his expertise to captains unfamiliar with the bay's hidden rocks and shifting currents. Nathaniel was 62 that spring, his face deeply lined from decades spent squinting against sun and salt spray, his knowledge of the bay so thorough he could navigate its channels blindfolded, guided purely by memory and instinct. He had learned piloting from his own father, who had guided ships through these same waters before him, passing down wisdom gathered across generations of careful observation. Ship captains from distant ports relied entirely on his expertise, understanding that Gull Bay's rocky shoreline and unpredictable tides required local knowledge no chart could fully capture. Nathaniel would climb aboard incoming vessels, taking command temporarily, guiding massive ships through narrow passages with calm confidence born from a lifetime spent studying the water's every mood and pattern. That particular spring, shipping traffic had increased steadily, cargo vessels bringing goods from distant cities, fishing boats returning with abundant catches after a difficult winter. Nathaniel felt the familiar satisfaction of purposeful work, understanding his crucial role connecting Gull Bay to the wider world through safe passage across dangerous waters. Young sailors sometimes accompanied him, eager to learn the pilot's trade, watching carefully as he read subtle signs in the water's color and movement, signs invisible to untrained eyes but clear as written words to Nathaniel's practiced gaze. He taught patiently, understanding the importance of passing this vital knowledge forward to future generations. In quieter afternoons, when no ships awaited guidance, Nathaniel would sit near the harbor, watching gulls circle above fishing boats, listening to waves lapping gently against the rocky shore he knew so intimately. He had never fully retired, despite his age, finding deep purpose in remaining useful to his community and the sailors who trusted him completely. As evening settled over Gull Bay, Nathaniel would return to his modest home overlooking the water, his body tired but his spirit content, watching the sunset paint the harbor in gentle shades of gold and rose. That night, resting by his window, Nathaniel felt the profound satisfaction of a lifetime spent ensuring others' safe passage. Tomorrow, more ships would arrive, and he would once again offer his steady, trusted guidance through waters he had come to know as intimately as his own heartbeat. The printer of Barrow Street. In the winter of 1926, in a small town in New Jersey called Barrow Falls, there lived a printer named Elias Hargrove, whose modest shop had produced the town's weekly newspaper for nearly 22 years. The shop sat above a hardware store on Barrow Street, its windows often steamed from the heat of the printing press that dominated the cramped back room. Elias was 50 that winter, ink permanently staining the creases of his hands, his eyesight sharpened by years spent arranging tiny metal type into columns of careful text. He had learned the trade as an apprentice in Philadelphia before returning home to Barrow Falls, determined to give his town a voice of its own, however small the circulation might be. The newspaper carried modest news, births and marriages, church socials, crop reports, and the occasional notice of a barn raising or town meeting. Yet Elias understood its importance to the community, how families clipped announcements to send relatives who had moved away, how farmers relied on his weather notes, how the entire town gathered its shared identity from the pages he set by hand each Wednesday night. That particular winter, an unusually harsh cold spell had settled over the region, and Elias found himself printing extra notices about frozen pipes, closed roads, and the town council's relief efforts for families struggling to keep warm. He worked later than usual those weeks, understanding that accurate, timely information mattered more than ever during difficult stretches of weather. His apprentice, a quiet young man named Thomas, worked alongside him most evenings, learning to set type with the same careful patience Elias had once learned from his own teacher. Elias enjoyed passing along his knowledge, watching Thomas gradually gain confidence with the heavy trays of lead letters and the temperamental old press. In rare quiet moments, Elias would sit near his shop's small stove, reviewing proofs before the final printing, catching errors with practiced attention, understanding that even small mistakes could ripple through a town where everyone read every line closely. He took quiet pride in accuracy, in fairness, in giving voice to ordinary lives rarely mentioned elsewhere. As evening deepened into night, the press finally fell silent, ink drying on freshly printed pages stacked and ready for morning distribution. Elias would bank the stove's fire, extinguish his lamp, and walk home through quiet, snow-dusted streets, his thoughts already turning toward next week's edition. That night, resting in his modest home, Elias felt the steady satisfaction of meaningful work faithfully done. Tomorrow, the paper would reach doorsteps and shops as it always had, continuing his quiet service to a town he had spent his life informing and connecting. The Midwife of Sparrow Creek. In the autumn of 1931, in a small farming community in Georgia called Sparrow Creek, there lived a midwife named Vera Colson, who had delivered nearly every baby born in the valley for over 25 years. Her small satchel of tools and remedies, worn smooth from years of use, rested always near her door, ready for the calls that could come at any hour of day or night. Vera was 53 that autumn, her hands gentle but sure, her manner calm even in moments of great urgency. She had learned her craft from her own mother, who had served the community before her, passing down knowledge of herbs, careful observation, and quiet reassurance that had comforted generations of anxious mothers throughout the valley. Families trusted her completely, understanding that Vera's presence meant steady competence during one of life's most vulnerable moments. She traveled by horse and buggy along rutted country roads, sometimes through storms or bitter cold, never hesitating when word arrived that a birth was near, understanding the urgency such moments demanded. That particular autumn had brought several births in close succession, and Vera found herself moving between farmhouses scattered across the valley, carrying with her not just medical knowledge, but the deep reassurance of her calm, steady presence. She remembered every child she had helped bring into the world, watching them grow into farmhands, mothers, and fathers themselves. Young women often sought her counsel beyond childbirth itself, trusting her wisdom regarding illness, herbal remedies, and the quiet worries that accompanied family life in isolated farming communities. Vera listened patiently, offering guidance gathered from decades of experience and careful attention to those she served. In quieter moments between calls, Vera tended her own small garden, growing herbs she relied upon for various remedies, understanding the land's rhythms as intimately as she understood the rhythms of childbirth itself. She had never married, devoting her life entirely to her calling, finding deep purpose in service to her community's most tender moments. As evening settled over Sparrow Creek, Vera would often sit on her porch, resting after a long day's travel, watching stars emerge above quiet fields, grateful for another successful delivery, another family made whole. That night, resting peacefully in her modest home, Vera felt the profound satisfaction of a life spent easing others through moments of uncertainty and joy. Tomorrow, another call might come, and she would rise once more, ready to offer her steady hands and calm reassurance to whichever family needed her most. The grain miller of Poplar Bend. In the autumn of 1923, in a small farming town in Iowa called Poplar Bend, there lived a grain miller named Edward Hoffman, whose family's mill had ground wheat and corn for local farmers for nearly 50 years. The mill sat beside a modest creek, its great wooden water wheel turning steadily, powering machinery that had remained largely unchanged since his grandfather first built the structure. Edward was 57 that autumn, his hair dusted permanently with fine flour, his shoulders strong from decades hauling heavy sacks of grain up wooden stairs to the mill's upper floors. He had inherited the business from his father, who had inherited it from his own father before that, each generation maintaining the same careful attention to quality that farmers throughout the valley had come to depend upon. The harvest season kept Edward especially busy, farmers arriving with wagon loads of freshly cut wheat, waiting patiently while he ground their grain into flour, exchanging news and friendly conversation as the mill's steady rhythm filled the air. He knew every farming family in the valley, understood which fields produced the finest wheat, which years brought hardship, which brought abundance. That particular autumn had yielded a bountiful harvest after several difficult seasons, and Edward felt the valley's collective relief reflected in the steady stream of wagons arriving at his mill each day. He worked long hours, ensuring every farmer's grain was processed carefully, understanding that flour quality directly affected bread on tables throughout the coming winter months. His son, a boy of 17, worked alongside him most days, learning the mill's intricate mechanisms, the careful balance required to produce consistent, quality flour. Edward found deep satisfaction teaching him, watching pride grow in his son's understanding of a trade that had sustained their family for generations. In quieter evening hours, after the last wagon departed, Edward would walk along the creek bank, listening to water rushing past the great wheel, feeling the particular peace that came from watching his family's legacy continue steadily forward. He thought often of his father and grandfather, understanding himself as merely one link in a much longer chain. As darkness settled over Poplar Bend, Edward would close the mill's heavy doors, walking home through fields turning gold and amber beneath the autumn moon, his body tired but his heart content with purposeful work. That night, resting quietly, Edward felt the deep satisfaction of continuing something larger than himself. Tomorrow, farmers would return with their harvest, and the mill would turn once more, sustaining the valley as it always had. The signal operator of Pine Ridge Station. In the winter of 1935, in a small railroad town in Montana called Pine Ridge, there lived a signal operator named Charles Redmond, whose small wooden tower overlooking the tracks had been his post for nearly 18 years. From his elevated perch, Charles controlled the mechanical signals that guided freight and passenger trains safely through the mountain pass, a responsibility he carried with quiet, unwavering seriousness. Charles was 48 that winter, his eyesight keen despite years spent squinting through fog and snow to spot approaching trains along the winding mountain track. He had taken the position after an injury ended his years working as a brakeman, finding in this steadier, solitary work a peace he hadn't expected, watching over the vital passage where several rail lines converged. The railroad depended entirely on operators like Charles, understanding that a single mistimed signal could mean disaster along the narrow mountain pass. He worked with careful precision, checking his logbooks constantly, communicating with distant stations through telegraph, ensuring every train received accurate information about track conditions and oncoming traffic. That particular winter had brought heavy snowfall, and Charles found his responsibilities especially demanding, monitoring drifts that sometimes threatened to obscure his signals, coordinating closely with track crews working to keep the vital mountain passage clear. He rarely left his post during storms, understanding that trains depended on his steady vigilance regardless of weather. In quieter hours between trains, Charles would sit near his small stove, reading or mending equipment, occasionally exchanging telegraph messages with operators at neighboring stations, brief connections that eased the solitude of his isolated post. He had grown fond of these distant colleagues, though he rarely met them in person, their voices through Morse code becoming familiar companions during long winter nights. He thought often of his wife, waiting for him in their small house near the base of the mountain, and of his daughter, growing quickly, already curious about the trains her father helped guide safely through treacherous terrain. He found deep purpose in this responsibility, understanding lives depended on his careful attention. As evening approached, lanterns began appearing at his signal tower, casting warm light against the gathering mountain darkness. Charles would check his equipment one final time before his replacement arrived, ensuring everything remained in perfect order. That night, walking home through snow-covered paths, Charles felt the deep satisfaction of demanding, essential work faithfully performed. Tomorrow, he would climb his tower once more, continuing the vigilant, steady service that kept trains moving safely through the mountain pass he had come to know so well. The dairy farmer of Hollyhock Lane. In the spring of 1946, in a small farming community in Wisconsin called Hollyhock, there lived a dairy farmer named Herman Voss, whose modest herd of cows had sustained his family for nearly 30 years. Each morning, long before sunrise painted the sky above his rolling pastures, Herman rose to begin the milking, his lantern swaying gently as he walked the familiar path to the barn. Herman was 54 that spring, his hands calloused and strong from decades of daily labor, his rhythm with the herd so practiced that he could recognize each cow's particular temperament without needing to glance twice. He had taken over the farm from his father, who had cleared this same land generations earlier, building a modest but steady life from dairy and hard-won soil. The war had recently ended, and Herman's youngest son had returned home that spring, bringing with him a quiet gratitude for ordinary mornings spent among familiar fields and gentle animals. Herman felt a deep relief watching his son settle back into farm rhythms, relearning patience beside cows that required no urgency, only steady, faithful care. Each morning, Herman moved methodically between stalls, his hands finding practiced rhythm against udders warm in the cool barn air, milk pinging softly into steel pails. The barn held its own particular comfort, hay and animal warmth mixing pleasantly against the chill of early spring mornings, familiar scents that had marked every day of his adult life. After milking, Herman would drive his wagon along the county road, delivering fresh milk to neighboring families and the small creamery in town, exchanging brief greetings with fellow farmers doing the same rounds. The community depended on this quiet, daily exchange, a network of trust built through decades of reliable service. In the afternoons, Herman tended his pastures, mending fences, checking on calves born that season, understanding the land's needs as intimately as his own family's. He thought often of his father, imagining him walking these same fields decades before, feeling connected to a lineage of steady, patient labor. As evening approached, Herman returned to the barn for a second milking, his son now working alongside him, their movements gradually synchronizing into shared rhythm. Golden light spread across the pastures as cows settled peacefully for the night. That evening, resting on his porch, Herman felt the deep satisfaction of continuity restored, of steady work shared once more between father and son. Tomorrow, he would rise again before dawn, continuing the patient rhythm that had sustained his family through generations of quiet devotion. The glassblower of Amber Hill. In the summer of 1930, in a small town in West Virginia called Amber Hill, there lived a glassblower named Frederick Wachtel, whose small workshop near the edge of town had produced bottles, jars, and delicate ornaments for nearly 25 years. The workshop's furnace burned constantly, filling the building with shimmering heat even during the coolest months, its glow visible through small windows long after dusk settled over the surrounding hills. Frederick was 52 that summer, his forearms strong and scarred from decades handling molten glass, his breath controlled and steady through the long blowpipe that shaped raw material into useful, beautiful objects. He had learned the craft from his father, who had brought the trade from Germany, teaching young Frederick patience and precise timing at an age when the furnace's heat still frightened him. The town relied on him for practical items, canning jars for harvest season, medicine bottles for the local pharmacy, glass panes for windows damaged in storms. Yet Frederick took particular joy in crafting delicate ornaments during quieter months, small glass birds and flowers that farmers' wives purchased as gifts for daughters or as modest decorations for parlor windows. That particular summer, orders for canning jars had increased significantly, families preparing for a season of preserving vegetables and fruit from gardens finally recovering after difficult years. Frederick worked long hours before his furnace, his movements practiced and sure, transforming glowing gathers of glass into sturdy jars that would hold a family's harvest through winter months ahead. His young apprentice, a boy of 16, worked the bellows and prepared materials, gradually learning the delicate timing required to shape glass before it cooled beyond workability. Frederick taught patiently, remembering his own early struggles, understanding that mastery required years of careful, humble practice before true skill emerged. In rare quiet evenings, Frederick would sit outside his workshop, cooling from the day's heat, watching stars emerge above the surrounding hills, feeling grateful for work that combined practical necessity with genuine artistry. He thought often of his father, imagining him proud of the craft carried forward faithfully into a new generation. As night deepened over Amber Hill, the furnace's glow softened, banked carefully for the following morning's work. Frederick would walk home through quiet streets, his body tired but his spirit satisfied by another day's meaningful creation. That night, resting peacefully, Frederick felt the deep contentment of skilled, purposeful labor. Tomorrow, his furnace would blaze once more, continuing the careful, ancient craft passed down through his family's steady hands. The basketmaker of Cypress Hollow. In the autumn of 1932, in a small bayou community in Louisiana called Cypress Hollow, there lived a basketmaker named Josephine Arsenault, whose small cabin near the water's edge had produced woven baskets for nearly 30 years. She gathered river cane and swamp grasses herself, wading carefully through shallow waters to select materials strong enough for the sturdy, beautiful baskets her family had crafted for generations. Josephine was 59 that autumn, her fingers thick with calluses earned from decades of splitting cane and weaving intricate patterns passed down from her grandmother, who had learned the craft from her own mother before slavery's end. She carried this inheritance with quiet pride, understanding each basket held within its weave a history stretching back further than she could fully trace. The Bayou families depended on her baskets for practical purposes, carrying crawfish from traps, storing rice and vegetables, hauling laundry to the water's edge. Yet Josephine's work held beauty beyond mere function, intricate patterns she varied slightly for each customer, understanding that even practical objects deserved careful, thoughtful craftsmanship. That particular autumn, the crawfish harvest had been abundant, and Josephine found herself especially busy fulfilling orders for sturdy carrying baskets, her hands moving with practiced rhythm as she split cane into thin, flexible strips before beginning the careful process of weaving. She worked most days on her small porch overlooking the slow-moving bayou, watching herons wade nearby as she labored. Her granddaughter, a girl of 12, often sat beside her, gradually learning the careful movements required to weave cane properly, absorbing patience alongside technique. Josephine taught gently, remembering her own grandmother's careful instruction, understanding the importance of passing this inheritance forward before it might otherwise be lost. In quieter afternoons, neighbors would stop by her porch, exchanging news and stories while Josephine continued her steady weaving, her attention divided comfortably between conversation and craft, her hands never quite stopping their familiar work. As evening settled over Cypress Hollow, mist rising gently from the bayou waters, Josephine would set aside her work, watching fireflies begin their soft glow among the cypress trees, feeling the deep peace of another day's meaningful labor completed. That night, resting in her small cabin, Josephine felt profound gratitude for a craft connecting her intimately to generations before her. Tomorrow, she would return to her porch, continuing patient work that honored both her ancestors and the bayou community she had served faithfully throughout her life. The stonemason of Quarry Ridge. In the summer of 1929, in a small town in New Hampshire called Quarry Ridge, there lived a stonemason named Patrick Sullivan, whose skilled hands had shaped granite into foundations, walls, and monuments for nearly 35 years. The local quarry, carved deep into the hillside, provided stone for buildings throughout the region, and Patrick had spent his entire adult life learning its particular character, understanding which blocks would split cleanly and which held hidden flaws. Patrick was 61 that summer, his shoulders broad and strong despite his age, his hands scarred from decades handling chisels and hammers against unforgiving granite. He had arrived from Ireland as a young man, finding work immediately in the quarry, gradually mastering a craft that demanded both physical strength and remarkable patience, understanding stone's stubborn nature required respect rather than force. The town depended on him for church foundations, bridge supports, and gravestones that would mark generations of families for centuries to come. Patrick approached each project with equal seriousness, understanding that stone work, unlike lesser materials, demanded permanence, requiring precision that would outlast the mason himself by many lifetimes. That particular summer, he was completing a new stone wall for the town's growing cemetery, carefully fitting each granite block without mortar, relying entirely on precise cutting and careful balance, a technique his own father had taught him back in Ireland. He worked slowly, deliberately, understanding this wall would stand long after everyone currently living had passed from memory. His son worked alongside him, gradually learning the craft's demanding requirements, developing calluses and patience that mirrored Patrick's own younger years. Patrick taught carefully, remembering his own early mistakes, understanding that true mastery required years of humble practice before confidence emerged naturally. In quieter evening hours, Patrick would walk through town, admiring buildings and walls he had helped construct decades earlier, feeling quiet satisfaction knowing his work had proven as permanent as intended. He thought often of his father, imagining him proud of skills carried faithfully across an ocean and generations. As evening settled over Quarry Ridge, Patrick would return home, his muscles pleasantly tired, his mind at peace with another day's demanding, purposeful labor completed with characteristic care. That night, resting quietly, Patrick felt the deep satisfaction of work built to last centuries. Tomorrow, he would return to his stone, continuing the patient, enduring craft that had shaped both his hands and his entire meaningful life. The rope maker of Saltmarsh Bay. In the winter of 1924, in a small coastal town in Rhode Island called Saltmarsh Bay, there lived a rope maker named Isaac Bledsoe, whose long, narrow ropewalk building had supplied fishing vessels and merchant ships with sturdy cordage for nearly 40 years. The building stretched almost the length of a city block, allowing workers to twist hemp fibers into rope length sufficient for even the largest sailing vessels. Isaac was 64 that winter, his hands roughened from decades handling coarse hemp fiber, his understanding of proper tension and twist so thorough he could judge rope quality simply by touch. He had learned the trade from his uncle, who had operated the ropewalk before him, teaching Isaac patience and precision required for cordage that sailors' lives would ultimately depend upon. The harbor's fishing fleet trusted him completely, understanding that properly made rope meant safety during storms at sea, security when hauling nets heavy with catch, reliability when anchoring against unpredictable tides. Isaac took this responsibility seriously, inspecting each length carefully, rejecting any rope that showed the slightest weakness or inconsistency. That particular winter, orders had increased as fishing captains prepared their vessels for the coming season, wanting fresh rope replacing lines worn from the previous year's demanding work. Isaac and his small crew worked steadily through the cold months, their breath visible in the unheated ropewalk, hands moving with practiced rhythm despite the biting chill. His nephew, a young man of 20, worked alongside him, gradually absorbing the careful techniques required for quality rope making, understanding tension and timing that could not be rushed without compromising strength. Isaac taught patiently, remembering his own uncle's careful instruction decades before, understanding this knowledge needed careful preservation. In quieter moments, Isaac would walk to the harbor's edge, watching fishing boats secured by rope he had made years earlier, feeling quiet pride in cordage that had proven reliable through countless storms and demanding voyages. He thought of sailors whose safety depended partly on his careful craftsmanship. As evening settled over Saltmarsh Bay, Isaac would close the ropewalk, walking home along frozen streets, his body tired but satisfied by another day's essential, demanding labor. That night, resting by his fire, Isaac felt the deep satisfaction of work directly tied to others' safety and survival. Tomorrow, he would return to his ropewalk, continuing the careful, vital craft that connected him intimately to the fishing community he had served faithfully for decades. The candlemaker of Winter Hollow. In the autumn of 1921, in a small town in Vermont called Winter Hollow, there lived a candlemaker named Abigail Foss, whose small workshop behind her farmhouse had produced candles for the community for nearly 20 years. She rendered tallow and beeswax herself, working carefully over a modest fire, understanding the precise temperatures required before dipping wicks repeatedly into the warm, fragrant liquid. Abigail was 45 that autumn, widowed for nearly a decade, having taken up her late husband's small candle-making business to support herself and her 2 children. Her hands moved with practiced patience, dipping wicks again and again, building layers gradually until sturdy candles emerged, ready to light homes throughout the surrounding countryside once electricity remained scarce in rural areas. The townspeople relied on her steady supply, particularly as winter approached and daylight grew shorter, families needing reliable candles for evening chores, reading, and simple companionship against the darkness. Abigail understood this quiet necessity, working diligently through autumn months to ensure her neighbors never faced winter without adequate light. That particular autumn, she had experimented with scented candles using dried lavender and cedar shavings gathered from nearby woods, offering small luxuries alongside her practical everyday candles. Farmers' wives appreciated these thoughtful additions, small comforts during otherwise difficult, laborious lives spent managing households and children. Her daughter, 12 years old, helped after school, learning to trim wicks and arrange finished candles for sale, gradually absorbing her mother's careful, patient techniques. Abigail taught gently, understanding this small trade might someday support her daughter as it had supported her own family through difficult years following her husband's passing. In quieter afternoons, neighbors would stop by her workshop, exchanging news while Abigail continued her steady dipping, the workshop filled with the sweet scent of beeswax and rendered tallow. She found comfort in this rhythm, in providing something essential and useful to families throughout her small community. As evening settled over Winter Hollow, Abigail would extinguish her workshop fire, gathering her children for supper, grateful for work that sustained her family while serving her neighbors' genuine needs. That night, resting quietly by candlelight of her own making, Abigail felt deep satisfaction in her steady, necessary craft. Tomorrow, she would return to her workshop, continuing patient work that brought light into homes throughout the gathering darkness of approaching winter. The Tanner of Buckthorn Ridge. In the winter of 1927, in a small town in Pennsylvania called Buckthorn Ridge, there lived a tanner named Jacob Reinhold, whose modest tannery beside the creek had processed hides into leather for nearly 30 years. The work was demanding and often unpleasant, requiring long hours soaking hides in solutions of bark and water, yet Jacob approached his trade with quiet dignity, understanding its essential place within the community. Jacob was 56 that winter, his hands permanently stained from years handling tanning solutions, his sense of smell adjusted long ago to odors that newcomers found overwhelming. He had learned the craft from his father, who had established the tannery decades earlier, providing leather for boots, harnesses, and countless practical items throughout the surrounding farming community. Farmers depended on him for durable harness leather, essential for their working horses, while local cobblers relied on his hides for boots that would withstand years of demanding labor. Jacob understood his trade's importance, even as it required him to work largely apart from town, his tannery positioned downstream where its necessary odors would trouble fewer neighbors. That particular winter, business remained steady despite difficult economic times, farmers unable to avoid replacing worn harness leather regardless of financial hardship. Jacob worked patiently through cold months, understanding proper tanning required months of careful attention regardless of season, hides moving slowly through various stages before reaching usable leather. His son, 18 years old, worked alongside him, gradually learning techniques passed down through generations, understanding that mastery required patience with an often unglamorous but genuinely necessary craft. Jacob taught steadily, remembering his own early reluctance before gradually understanding his trade's quiet importance to the entire community. In rare quiet moments, Jacob would walk along the creek bank near his tannery, appreciating winter's stillness, understanding his work, though unpleasant to some, provided essential materials that supported farming families throughout the region. He found dignity in this necessary, demanding labor. As evening settled over Buckthorn Ridge, Jacob would secure his tannery, walking home through cold, quiet streets, his body tired from demanding physical labor, his mind settled with the satisfaction of essential work faithfully performed. That night, resting by his fire, Jacob felt quiet pride in supporting his community through necessary, if unglamorous, craft. Tomorrow, he would return to his tannery, continuing patient work that clothed and equipped families throughout the surrounding countryside. In the peaceful countryside of ancient Campania, not far from the Bay of Naples, there lived a vintner named Gaius Livius Sabinus, whose sprawling vineyards had produced wine for the region for nearly 4 decades. The hillside terraces stretched gently toward the horizon, rows of grapevines trained carefully along wooden trellises, their leaves rustling softly beneath the warm afternoon sun. Gaius was 60 years old, his back slightly bent from decades spent tending vines, his hands permanently stained faint purple from countless harvests of dark, sweet grapes. He had learned viticulture from his own father, who had planted many of these very vines, teaching Gaius patience and careful observation long before he understood their deeper wisdom. The local villages relied on his wine for daily meals, festivals honoring the gods, and simple gatherings among friends and family. Gaius took great care in his craft, understanding that good wine required not just skilled pressing, but patient aging within clay amphorae stored carefully in his cool, stone cellar beneath the villa. That particular season had brought a bountiful harvest, grapes swollen with sweetness after generous autumn rains. Gaius rose each morning before sunrise, walking among his vines with quiet reverence, inspecting clusters carefully, determining precisely when each row had reached perfect ripeness for the harvest that would soon begin. His daughter, 16 years old, worked alongside him during harvest season, her small hands quick among the vines, gradually learning which clusters held the finest sweetness, which required another few days of sun before picking. Gaius taught her patiently, remembering his own childhood spent learning these same hillside paths from his father. Workers gathered each morning during harvest, singing traditional songs as they moved methodically through the terraces, filling woven baskets with dark, fragrant grapes destined for the great stone pressing vats. Gaius often joined the pressing himself, feeling grapes burst beneath bare feet, the sweet juice flowing steadily into waiting vessels below. In quieter evening hours, after the day's labor concluded, Gaius would walk alone among his vines, watching the sun descend behind distant hills, the sky deepening into shades of amber and rose above the peaceful Campanian countryside. He often paused to touch the oldest vines, planted by his grandfather, feeling connected to generations of careful cultivation. As evening fully settled, Gaius would return to his modest villa, sharing bread, olives, and a cup of last season's wine with his family, grateful for another day spent honoring an ancient craft passed down faithfully through generations. That night, resting peacefully as cicadas sang softly beneath star-filled skies, Gaius felt the deep contentment of tending something timeless. Tomorrow, he would return to his beloved vines, continuing patient work that connected him intimately to both. The olive grove of Marcus Aurelius Faber. In the twilight years of the Roman Empire, in a quiet countryside villa outside the city of Pompeii, there lived a farmer named Marcus Aurelius Faber, whose family had tended olive groves upon these gentle hills for 3 generations. The villa stood modestly amid rows of ancient, twisted olive trees, their silver-green leaves rustling softly in the warm Mediterranean breeze that carried the scent of sea salt and sun-warmed earth. Marcus was 53 years old, his skin weathered deeply bronze from decades spent beneath the Italian sun, his hands strong and calloused from years of careful harvest. He had inherited the groves from his father, who had inherited them from his own father before that, each generation adding new trees along the hillside, understanding that olive trees rewarded patience, often requiring decades before reaching full, generous maturity. The nearby villages depended upon his harvest, farmers and merchants alike understanding that Marcus produced some of the finest oil in the entire region, prized for cooking, for lamps that lit homes through dark evenings, and for the ceremonial oils used in household shrines honoring the ancient gods. Marcus took quiet pride in this reputation, earned through decades of careful, unhurried cultivation. That particular autumn, the harvest had proven especially abundant, branches heavy with dark, ripening olives ready for careful picking. Marcus rose each morning before dawn, walking among his trees with practiced ease, directing his workers gently, understanding that rushed harvesting damaged both fruit and future yield, patience being the olive farmer's most essential virtue. His son, a young man of 20, worked alongside him, gradually learning the subtle signs that indicated proper ripeness, the careful pressing techniques passed down through generations, the patient waiting required before oil reached its finest quality. Marcus taught steadily, remembering his own father's careful instruction beneath these same ancient branches decades before. In the cooling evening hours, after the day's harvest concluded, Marcus would walk slowly among his groves, watching golden evening light filter through silver leaves, listening to distant sounds of sheep bells and cicadas singing their gentle evening chorus across the sun-warmed hillside. He often paused near the oldest tree, planted by his grandfather generations earlier, its gnarled trunk twisted by decades of Mediterranean winds, yet still producing fruit each autumn with remarkable, faithful generosity. Marcus felt deeply connected to this ancient rhythm, understanding himself as merely one caretaker within a much longer, patient continuity. As evening settled fully over the countryside, stars emerging above darkening hills, Marcus would return to his modest villa, sharing simple bread, cheese, and wine with his family, grateful for another day's meaningful, honest labor beneath skies. The cheesemaker of Maplewood Farm. In the summer of 1939, in a small dairy community in Vermont called Maplewood, there lived a cheesemaker named Louisa Pruitt, whose stone cellar beneath her farmhouse had aged wheels of cheddar for nearly 22 years. She had learned the craft from her mother-in-law, mastering the patient art of curdling fresh milk, pressing curds, and waiting months for proper aging before her cheese reached the tables of families throughout the valley. Louisa was 49 that summer, her forearms strong from years stirring heavy vats of warming milk, her instincts sharp enough to know precisely when curds had reached proper consistency simply by touch and scent. Her husband managed the dairy herd, while Louisa transformed their milk into cheese that had become known throughout the county for its rich, distinctive flavor. The farm's stone cellar remained cool year-round, perfect for aging the great wheels that lined wooden shelves in careful rows, each marked with the date of its creation, waiting patiently while flavors deepened and developed over passing months. Louisa visited daily, turning each wheel carefully, checking for proper rind development, understanding that patience mattered as much as skill in producing quality cheese. That particular summer, milk production had been abundant following good spring rains, and Louisa found herself especially busy, transforming the farm's generous supply into cheese that would sustain the family through leaner winter months when demand for fresh milk decreased but cheese remained valuable. She worked long hours in her warm kitchen, stirring vats with rhythmic, practiced movements. Her daughter, 16 years old, had begun learning the craft that summer, gradually understanding the careful timing and temperature control required for successful cheesemaking. Louisa taught patiently, remembering her own early struggles, understanding that mastery required years of careful practice before true confidence emerged. In quieter evening hours, Louisa would walk down to her cellar, inhaling the rich, earthy scent of aging cheese, feeling deep satisfaction watching her careful work slowly transform into something valuable and lasting. She thought often of her mother-in-law, grateful for knowledge passed down so generously. As evening settled over Maplewood Farm, Louisa would close her cellar door, walking back toward her farmhouse, her body tired but her spirit content with another day's patient, meaningful labor. That night, resting quietly, Louisa felt the deep satisfaction of craft requiring both skill and patience. Tomorrow, she would return to her vats, continuing steady work that sustained her family through every season. The Potter of Arretium. In the quiet hill town of Arretium in ancient Italy, there lived a potter named Lucius Cassius Varro, whose small workshop had produced fine red-glazed pottery for the region for nearly 35 years. His workshop stood beside a modest kiln, its walls blackened from decades of firing, smoke often curling gently into the warm Tuscan sky above rows of terracotta rooftops. Lucius was 58 years old, his fingers permanently stained with fine red clay, his hands steady and sure from decades spent shaping vessels upon his simple wooden wheel. He had learned the craft from his father, who had built the workshop generations earlier, teaching Lucius patience and precise timing required to transform ordinary clay into vessels prized throughout the countryside. Merchants traveled considerable distances to purchase his finely made bowls, cups, and storage jars, understanding that Arretium's pottery held particular reputation for quality and lasting durability. Lucius took quiet pride in this recognition, earned through decades of careful attention to proportion, thickness, and the precise temperatures required within his kiln. That particular season, orders had increased steadily as merchants prepared shipments bound for distant ports across the sea. Lucius worked long days at his wheel, his foot maintaining steady rhythm against the spinning mechanism below, his hands guiding wet clay upward into graceful, familiar shapes he had perfected across decades of practiced repetition. His young apprentice, a boy of 14, worked alongside him, learning gradually to center clay properly upon the wheel, absorbing patience required before confidence could emerge naturally. Lucius taught steadily, remembering his own early frustrations, understanding mastery demanded years of humble practice before true skill developed. In quieter afternoon hours, Lucius would sit near his kiln, watching carefully as fire consumed carefully stacked wood, monitoring temperature through small openings, understanding that proper firing required careful attention lest months of careful shaping be ruined through impatience or carelessness. Neighbors often stopped by his workshop, exchanging news while Lucius continued his steady work, his attention divided comfortably between friendly conversation and the clay spinning steadily beneath his experienced hands. He found deep contentment in this familiar rhythm, connecting him to both his community and his ancestors. As evening settled over Arretium, golden light filtering through workshop windows, Lucius would bank his kiln fire carefully, ensuring proper cooling through the night ahead. He would walk home through quiet streets, his body tired but satisfied by another day's meaningful, skilled labor. That night, resting peacefully within his modest home, Lucius felt the deep satisfaction of craft passed down faithfully through generations. The Shepherd of Apennine Hills. In the rugged Apennine hills of ancient Italy, there lived a shepherd named Titus Flavius Rutilius, whose flock of sheep had grazed these same grassy slopes for nearly 40 years. His simple stone hut stood at the edge of a wide pasture, surrounded by rolling hills that turned brilliant green each spring, then golden brown beneath the summer sun. Titus was 62 years old, his skin deeply weathered from decades spent beneath open sky, his legs strong from countless miles walked guiding his flock between seasonal pastures. He had inherited the shepherding life from his father, who had walked these same hillside paths, teaching Titus the patient rhythms of tending animals that depended entirely upon careful, watchful guidance. The nearby villages relied upon his flock for wool, milk, and cheese, understanding that Titus produced some of the finest wool in the entire region, prized for weaving into warm winter garments. He took quiet pride in this reputation, earned through decades spent understanding each animal's particular needs and the subtle signs indicating approaching weather or danger. That particular season, lambing had proven especially successful, new lambs strengthening quickly upon the hillside grasses, filling the pastures with their gentle bleating each morning. Titus rose before dawn daily, walking among his flock with practiced calm, counting carefully, ensuring none had wandered during the night toward dangerous ravines or wolves that occasionally prowled the higher elevations. His grandson, a boy of 13, had begun accompanying him that season, gradually learning to read the flock's subtle movements, understanding which sheep required particular attention, absorbing patience that shepherding demanded above all other qualities. Titus taught gently, remembering his own boyhood spent learning these same hillside paths from his father decades before. In quieter afternoon hours, Titus would rest beneath ancient oak trees scattered across the pasture, watching his flock graze peacefully, listening to distant sheep bells mixing gently with wind moving through summer grasses. He carried always a simple wooden flute, playing soft melodies that seemed to calm his animals during long, peaceful afternoons. As evening approached, Titus would guide his flock carefully toward the stone enclosure near his hut, counting each animal twice, ensuring all remained safely accounted for before darkness fully settled across the hillside. He found deep satisfaction in this evening ritual, a responsibility carried faithfully throughout his entire adult life. That night, resting within his modest hut, listening to his flock settling peacefully nearby, Titus felt the profound contentment of a life devoted to patient, watchful care. Tomorrow, he would rise again before dawn, continuing the ancient, faithful rhythm that connected him intimately to both his ancestors and the timeless Apennine Hills. In the bustling port town of Ostia near ancient Rome, there lived a baker named Quintus Aemilius Bulbus, whose small bakery near the harbor had supplied bread to sailors, merchants, and dockworkers for nearly 28 years. His stone oven, built by his father decades earlier, radiated steady warmth throughout the modest shop, filling the narrow street outside with the comforting scent of fresh bread each morning. Quintus was 50 years old, his forearms strong from years kneading heavy dough, his hands quick and sure shaping loaves that fed the constant stream of travelers passing through this vital Roman port. He had learned baking from his father, who had established the shop generations earlier, understanding that Ostia's busy harbor demanded reliable, honest bread day after day without fail. Sailors arriving from distant Mediterranean ports often sought out his bakery first, remembering the simple comfort of fresh bread after weeks spent aboard cramped, uncertain vessels. Quintus took quiet pride in this reputation, understanding his bread offered weary travelers a small, familiar comfort amid the unfamiliar chaos of a busy trading port. That particular season, grain shipments had arrived steadily from Rome's fertile provinces, and Quintus found himself especially busy, rising each morning well before dawn to begin preparing dough for the day's demanding trade. He worked methodically, kneading, shaping, and monitoring his oven's steady heat with practiced attention earned through decades of careful repetition. His son, 19 years old, worked alongside him, gradually mastering the subtle timing required for properly risen dough, understanding the careful attention his father's oven demanded throughout each baking cycle. Quintus taught patiently, remembering his own early struggles, understanding mastery required years of humble practice before true confidence emerged. In quieter afternoon hours, after the morning's demanding rush concluded, Quintus would step outside his shop, watching ships arrive and depart from the busy harbor, understanding his own small but essential role within this vast network connecting distant peoples and goods throughout the Roman world. Neighbors and regular customers often lingered near his doorway, exchanging news from distant provinces carried by traveling merchants, while Quintus continued preparing dough for the following day's demanding trade. He found comfort in these exchanges, connecting his modest bakery to the wider currents of Roman life. As evening settled over Ostia, harbor lights beginning to flicker along the busy waterfront, Quintus would finally close his shop, walking home through narrow streets still carrying the scent of fresh bread upon his clothing. That night, resting peacefully, Quintus felt the deep satisfaction of essential, honest work faithfully performed. Tomorrow, he would rise again before dawn, continuing steady labor that nourished travelers from across the Roman world. The fishermen of Neapolis Bay. In the sparkling waters near ancient Neapolis, along the beautiful curve of the bay, there lived a fisherman named Publius Cornelius Rufus, whose small wooden boat had carried him across these familiar waters for nearly 38 years. His modest cottage stood just above the rocky shoreline, close enough that he could hear waves gently lapping against stones even while resting inside during quiet evenings. Publius was 59 years old, his skin deeply bronzed from decades spent beneath the bright Mediterranean sun, his shoulders strong from countless mornings hauling nets heavy with fish. He had learned fishing from his father, who had taught him to read the bay's subtle moods, understanding which waters held abundant fish during different seasons, which currents signaled approaching storms. The nearby markets depended upon his daily catch, understanding that Publius consistently brought reliable, fresh fish that fed families throughout Neapolis and surrounding villages. He took quiet pride in this dependable service, having built trust with local merchants across decades of honest, consistent labor upon these familiar waters. That particular season, fish had proven especially abundant following mild winter weather, and Publius found himself rising earlier than usual, guiding his small boat out before dawn's first light touched the water. He worked methodically, casting nets with practiced precision, understanding subtle signs indicating where fish gathered beneath the bay's calm surface. His son, 17 years old, worked alongside him most mornings, gradually learning to read wind patterns and water color, absorbing knowledge that would someday allow him to navigate these waters independently. Publius taught patiently, remembering his own father's careful instruction decades before upon this same gentle bay. In quieter afternoon hours, after the morning's catch had been sold at market, Publius would mend his nets along the shoreline, his fingers moving with practiced rhythm through familiar knots, repairing small tears before they might worsen during future voyages upon unpredictable waters. Neighbors often gathered near his boat in late afternoons, exchanging news while Publius continued his steady mending, his attention comfortably divided between friendly conversation and careful repair work that his livelihood depended upon entirely. As evening settled over Neapolis Bay, golden light spreading across calm waters, Publius would secure his boat carefully along the shore, watching fishing vessels return one by one as darkness gradually approached. That night, resting peacefully within his modest cottage, listening to waves continuing their eternal rhythm against nearby rocks, Publius felt deep contentment in work connecting him intimately to both the sea and his entire coastal community. The Weaver of Tarentum. In the ancient coastal city of Tarentum, famous throughout the region for its fine woolen textiles, there lived a weaver named Cornelia Fabia Prisca, whose modest workshop had produced cloth for nearly 26 years. Her wooden loom stood near a sunlit window, its steady rhythm filling her small home each morning as she transformed carefully spun wool into fabric prized throughout the southern Italian coast. Cornelia was 47 years old, her fingers quick and precise from decades spent guiding thread through her loom, her eyes trained to notice even the slightest irregularity within her careful patterns. She had learned weaving from her mother, who had taught her patience and precision at an age when other girls still played freely in the narrow streets outside their modest home. The local markets relied upon her steady production, understanding that Cornelia's woolen cloth held particular reputation for quality, durability, and the subtle, pleasing patterns she wove into simple garments worn throughout the community. She took quiet pride in this recognition, earned through decades of careful, unhurried attention to her craft. That particular season, wool had arrived plentifully from nearby shepherds' flocks, and Cornelia found herself especially busy, her loom's steady rhythm filling her home from early morning until fading afternoon light made careful work increasingly difficult. She worked methodically, her hands moving with practiced confidence through patterns she had perfected across decades. Her daughter, 14 years old, sat beside her most afternoons, gradually learning the careful movements required for proper weaving, absorbing patience that her mother understood as essential to producing quality work. Cornelia taught gently, remembering her own girlhood spent learning these same patient techniques from her own mother years before. In quieter morning hours, before the day's demanding work fully began, Cornelia would sit briefly near her window, watching neighbors passing through narrow streets below, listening to distant sounds of the busy harbor where ships arrived carrying goods from across the Mediterranean world. Neighbors often visited during afternoon hours, exchanging news and gentle conversation while Cornelia's hands continued their steady rhythm, her attention comfortably divided between friendly companionship and the careful craft her family had depended upon for generations. As evening settled over Tarentum, fading light making further weaving impossible, Cornelia would carefully set aside her work, covering her loom gently until morning light returned once more. That night, resting peacefully within her modest home, listening to distant harbor sounds carrying softly through her window, Cornelia felt deep satisfaction in patient, skilled work. Tomorrow, she would return to her loom, continuing steady labor connecting her intimately to both her ancestors and her entire coastal community. The salt gatherer of Ostia Marshes. Near the marshy coastline outside ancient Ostia, where shallow lagoons stretched toward the distant sea, there lived a salt gatherer named Servius Marcius Trebonius, whose family had harvested salt from these shallow pools for nearly 45 years. His modest hut stood at the edge of the salt flats, close enough that morning mist rising from the marshes often drifted gently against his simple wooden walls. Servius was 63 years old, his skin permanently darkened from decades spent beneath open sky, his eyes accustomed to the bright glare reflecting off shallow salt pans stretching toward the horizon. He had learned this ancient trade from his father, who had taught him to read the sun and wind carefully, understanding precisely when evaporation had progressed enough to harvest the precious white crystals forming along the pool's edges. The surrounding region depended entirely upon his salt, essential not merely for flavoring food, but for preserving meat and fish through demanding winter months when fresh provisions grew increasingly scarce. Servius took quiet pride in this fundamental service, understanding salt's vital importance to households throughout the entire coastal region. That particular season, favorable weather had produced abundant harvests, warm winds and steady sunshine accelerating evaporation across the shallow pools. Servius worked methodically each day, raking crystallized salt carefully into small mounds, understanding that careless handling could waste precious harvest that families depended upon completely. His grandson, 16 years old, worked alongside him that season, gradually learning to read subtle signs within the water and sky, absorbing patience that salt gathering demanded above all else. Servius taught gently, remembering his own boyhood spent learning these same patient techniques from his father decades earlier. In quieter midday hours, when the sun's heat grew too intense for continued labor, Servius would rest beneath a simple woven canopy, watching herons wade through nearby shallow waters, listening to distant sounds of gulls circling above the marshes. He found deep peace within this rhythm, connecting him to generations of patient, careful harvest. As evening approached, cooling breezes drifting across the flats, Servius would gather the day's harvest carefully into woven baskets, preparing for tomorrow's continued, essential labor beneath the ancient Roman sky. That night, resting peacefully within his humble hut, Servius felt the deep satisfaction of work sustaining entire communities. Tomorrow, he would return to his salt flats, continuing patient labor connecting him intimately to both his ancestors and the timeless coastal marshes he had tended faithfully throughout his life. The Blacksmith of Capua. In the ancient town of Capua in the fertile Campanian plain, there lived a blacksmith named Aulus Decimus Ferrarius, whose forge had shaped iron tools and implements for the surrounding farming community for nearly 30 years. His workshop stood at the edge of town, smoke curling steadily from his forge each morning, the rhythmic clang of hammer against anvil becoming familiar music throughout the surrounding streets. Aulus was 54 years old, his arms thick and powerful from decades shaping heated iron, his hands calloused and scarred from countless hours spent working near his forge's steady, glowing heat. He had learned his trade from his father, who had established the workshop generations earlier, teaching Aulus patience and precise timing required to transform raw iron into tools farmers depended upon completely. The surrounding farms relied upon him entirely, bringing broken plowshares, worn sickles, and damaged tools requiring careful repair before the demanding planting and harvest seasons arrived. Aulus took quiet pride in this essential service, understanding that his careful craftsmanship directly supported the agricultural rhythm sustaining the entire region's population. That particular season, farmers prepared eagerly for spring planting, bringing numerous tools requiring attention before fields could be properly worked. Aulus labored long hours before his forge, his hammer striking steadily against heated iron, transforming raw metal into implements that would soon till fertile Campanian soil once again. His son, 21 years old, worked alongside him, gradually mastering the demanding physical requirements and careful timing his father's trade demanded, understanding that true skill required years of patient practice before genuine confidence emerged naturally. Aulus taught steadily, remembering his own early struggles decades before. In quieter afternoon hours, farmers often lingered near his forge, exchanging news and agricultural wisdom while Aulus continued his steady, demanding work, his attention divided comfortably between friendly conversation and the glowing iron requiring his careful attention. As evening settled over Capua, Aulus would finally bank his forge's fire, wiping sweat and soot from his weathered face, feeling his tired muscles slowly relax after another day's demanding, essential labor. That night, resting peacefully within his modest home, listening to evening sounds drifting through open windows, Aulus felt the deep satisfaction of work directly supporting his entire farming community. Tomorrow, he would return to his forge, continuing patient, essential craft that connected him intimately to the agricultural rhythm sustaining generations throughout the fertile Campanian countryside. The Bath Keeper of Baiae. In the seaside resort town of Baiae along the beautiful Campanian coast, there lived a bath keeper named Titus Aelius Nerva, whose modest public baths had welcomed weary travelers and local residents alike for nearly 24 years. The stone building stood near warm natural springs, steam rising gently from pools that had drawn visitors to this coastal town for generations before his own lifetime. Titus was 46 years old, his movements calm and unhurried as he moved between the various rooms of his modest establishment, understanding the careful maintenance required to keep water properly heated, floors swept, and towels freshly laundered for the steady stream of visitors seeking relaxation and gentle conversation. He had inherited the baths from his uncle, learning gradually the countless small responsibilities such an establishment demanded. Local residents relied upon his baths not merely for cleanliness, but as a gathering place where news traveled freely, friendships deepened, and the day's burdens temporarily lifted amid warm water and pleasant company. Titus took quiet pride in maintaining this essential community space, understanding its importance extended well beyond simple bathing. That particular season, visitors had increased considerably as wealthy Romans traveled from the city seeking Baiae's famous warm springs and pleasant coastal air. Titus worked long hours ensuring his modest baths remained welcoming despite increased demand, understanding his reputation depended entirely upon consistent, careful attention to every visitor's comfort. His nephew, 18 years old, assisted him daily, gradually learning the countless small tasks required to maintain proper water temperature, cleanliness, and the welcoming atmosphere visitors expected. Titus taught patiently, remembering his own early uncertainty before gradually understanding the quiet satisfaction such service could provide. In quieter morning hours, before visitors fully arrived, Titus would walk through his baths, checking each pool carefully, ensuring everything remained properly prepared, taking a moment to appreciate steam rising gently against morning light filtering through high windows. As evening settled over Baiae, the day's visitors gradually departing toward nearby lodgings, Titus would close his baths carefully, extinguishing lamps, ensuring proper security before finally retiring to his modest quarters nearby. That night, resting peacefully, listening to distant waves along the beautiful coastline, Titus felt quiet satisfaction in providing genuine comfort to his community. Tomorrow, he would open his doors once more, continuing steady service that connected residents and travelers alike within this cherished coastal gathering place. The beekeeper's neighbor, the miller of Etruria. In the gentle countryside of ancient Etruria, near a modest stream that never ran dry even during summer's driest months, there lived a miller named Vibius Octavius Tullus, whose stone mill had ground grain for the surrounding farming villages for nearly 36 years. The great wooden water wheel turned steadily against the current, powering millstones his grandfather had installed generations before his own birth. Vibius was 57 years old, his hair dusted permanently with fine flour, his shoulders strong from decades hauling heavy sacks of grain between wagons and his mill's upper floors. He had learned the trade from his father, who had learned from his own father, each generation maintaining careful attention to quality that farming families throughout the region depended upon completely. Local farmers arrived regularly with wagon loads of wheat and barley, waiting patiently while Vibius ground their grain into flour, exchanging news and friendly conversation as his mill's steady rhythm filled the surrounding countryside air. He knew every farming family within walking distance, understood which fields produced particularly fine grain, which years brought hardship or abundance. That particular season, harvest had proven especially bountiful following favorable weather throughout the growing months, and Vibius found himself especially busy, ensuring every farmer's grain received careful, proper processing. He worked long hours, understanding that flour quality directly affected bread that would sustain families throughout the coming winter season. His son, 20 years old, worked alongside him daily, gradually learning the mill's careful mechanisms, understanding the delicate balance required to produce consistent, quality flour without wasting precious grain through careless handling. Vibius taught steadily, finding deep satisfaction watching genuine understanding develop within his son. In quieter evening hours, after the final wagon departed for the day, Vibius would walk along the streambank near his mill, listening to water rushing steadily past his great wheel, feeling the particular peace that came from watching his family's inherited work continue faithfully forward through another generation. As darkness settled over the Etrurian countryside, Vibius would close his mill's heavy wooden doors, walking homeward beneath emerging stars, his body tired but his heart content with purposeful, essential labor completed. That night, resting quietly within his modest home, Vibius felt the deep satisfaction of continuing something far larger than himself. Tomorrow, farmers would return once more with their harvest, and his mill would turn steadily forward, sustaining the countryside exactly as it always had for generations before him. The lamp maker of Herculaneum. In the coastal town of Herculaneum, nestled peacefully beneath the shadow of Mount Vesuvius, there lived a lamp maker named Gnaeus Aurelius Festus, whose modest workshop had produced simple clay oil lamps for the community for nearly 23 years. His workbench sat near an open window overlooking the harbor, sea breezes carrying the scent of salt and drying fish through his small, cluttered shop. Gnaeus was 44 years old, his fingers stained faintly with clay dust, his hands practiced and sure from years shaping wet clay into lamps that illuminated homes throughout the town each evening. He had learned the craft from his father, who had taught him patience and careful attention to proportion, understanding that even simple household items deserved genuine craftsmanship. Families throughout Herculaneum relied upon his steady production, understanding that reliable lamps meant safety and comfort during evening hours, allowing mothers to mend clothing, children to study their letters, and households to gather peacefully after daily labors concluded. Aeneas took quiet satisfaction knowing his humble work brought genuine comfort into countless homes. That particular season, business remained steady as always, families periodically needing replacement lamps as older ones cracked or broke through years of daily use. Aeneas worked methodically at his wheel, shaping clay with practiced rhythm, his movements so familiar after decades that his hands seemed to know precisely what shape each lump of clay wished to become. His daughter, 13 years old, had begun helping recently, learning to smooth rough edges and prepare wicks, gradually absorbing patience the craft demanded above all else. Aeneas taught gently, remembering his own childhood spent watching his father's careful, confident hands shaping similar vessels years before. In quieter afternoon hours, neighbors often stopped by his workshop, exchanging harbor news while Aeneas continued shaping clay, his attention comfortably divided between friendly conversation and his familiar, steady craft. He enjoyed this gentle rhythm connecting him intimately to his entire community. As evening settled over Herculaneum, golden light softening across rooftops, Aeneas would carefully arrange his day's finished lamps upon wooden shelves, ready for tomorrow's customers, before finally closing his modest shop for the night. That night, resting peacefully within his home, his own lamp glowing softly nearby, Aeneas felt quiet contentment in providing genuine comfort to his neighbors. Tomorrow, he would return to his wheel, continuing patient work that brought gentle light into homes throughout his beloved coastal town. The herb-gatherer of Umbria. In the wooded hills of ancient Umbria, where forest paths wound gently between fragrant pine and oak, there lived a herb-gatherer named Flavia Domitia Severa, whose knowledge of medicinal plants had served her mountain village for nearly 29 years. Her modest cottage stood at the forest's edge, bundles of drying herbs hanging from wooden beams, filling her home with earthy, fragrant scents that never quite faded. Flavia was 51 years old, her steps still light and sure along familiar forest paths, her eyes trained to spot particular plants others might easily overlook. She had learned her craft from her grandmother, who had taught her patiently which roots eased fever, which leaves calmed troubled stomachs, which flowers helped mothers through difficult childbirth, knowledge passed carefully through generations of watchful women. The village depended upon her completely, understanding that Flavia's careful knowledge often meant the difference between suffering and relief during illness. She walked these forest paths in every season, understanding precisely when each plant reached its most potent, most useful moment, gathering only what was needed, leaving enough behind for future growth. That particular season, unusually wet spring weather had produced abundant herbs throughout the forest floor, and Flavia found herself especially busy, gathering carefully each morning before dew had fully lifted from delicate leaves. She moved slowly through familiar groves, her woven basket gradually filling with plants she would later dry, grind, or prepare into simple remedies. Her niece, 17 years old, had begun accompanying her that season, gradually learning to identify plants correctly, understanding the careful timing required before gathering. Flavia taught patiently, remembering her own grandmother's careful instruction decades before, understanding this knowledge required careful preservation for future generations. In quieter afternoon hours, villagers often visited her cottage, seeking remedies for various ailments, sharing news while Flavia prepared simple treatments with practiced, confident hands. She listened carefully to each person's concerns, understanding that healing required patience alongside genuine knowledge of nature's quiet gifts. As evening settled over the Umbrian hills, Flavia would sit briefly outside her cottage, watching fireflies emerge among darkening trees, feeling deeply connected to the ancient forest that had sustained both her family and her entire community for generations. That night, resting peacefully within her fragrant cottage, Flavia felt profound gratitude for knowledge passed down faithfully through women before her. Tomorrow, she would return to the forest paths, continuing patient work that healed and comforted her beloved mountain village. The shipbuilder of Puteoli. In the busy harbor town of Puteoli along the Bay of Naples, there lived a shipbuilder named Lucius Sergius Paulinus, whose modest shipyard had constructed and repaired vessels for nearly 33 years. His workshop stood near the bustling docks, the steady sound of hammering and sawing mixing with distant calls of sailors and the constant rhythm of waves against the harbor's stone breakwater. Lucius was 56 years old, his hands calloused and strong from decades shaping timber into sturdy hulls, his understanding of wood grain and construction so thorough he could judge a ship's seaworthiness simply by walking its deck. He had learned shipbuilding from his father, who had taught him patience and precise measurement, understanding that lives depended entirely upon vessels built with genuine care. Merchants and fishermen throughout the busy port trusted him completely, understanding that Lucius constructed vessels capable of withstanding Mediterranean storms and demanding voyages to distant provinces. He approached each project with careful seriousness, selecting timber personally, understanding that shortcuts in construction could mean disaster upon unpredictable waters. That particular season, harbor traffic had increased considerably, merchants preparing vessels for trade routes stretching toward Egypt and distant eastern provinces. Lucius worked long hours alongside his skilled crew, shaping curved hull planks with practiced precision, understanding each joint required careful attention to ensure lasting strength against the sea's relentless pressure. His son, 23 years old, worked steadily beside him, gradually mastering techniques passed down through generations, understanding that true craftsmanship required years of patient practice before genuine confidence emerged. Lucius taught carefully, remembering his own early uncertainty before slowly developing the steady skill his trade demanded. In quieter evening hours, after his crew departed for the day, Lucius would walk along completed vessels resting within the harbor, admiring craftsmanship that would soon carry sailors safely across distant waters, feeling quiet pride in work built to endure demanding journeys. As evening settled over Puteoli, ships gently rocking against harbor waters, Lucius would secure his workshop carefully, walking homeward through streets filled with the mixed scents of salt water, fresh-cut timber, and distant cooking fires. That night, resting peacefully within his modest home, listening to familiar harbor sounds drifting through his window, Lucius felt the deep satisfaction of work directly tied to sailors' safety. Tomorrow, he would return to his shipyard, continuing patient, essential craft connecting him intimately to the vast Roman world across the sea. The papyrus scribe of Alexandria's Roman quarter. In the Roman quarter of ancient Alexandria, where scholars and merchants mingled along busy harbor streets, there lived a scribe named Marcus Antonius Scriba, whose modest workshop had produced carefully copied documents and letters for nearly 25 years. His small room overlooked a quiet courtyard, shelves lined with prepared papyrus scrolls, ink pots, and reed pens arranged with careful, methodical order. Marcus was 48 years old, his fingers stained permanently with dark ink, his handwriting so precise and elegant that merchants and officials throughout the district specifically sought his careful services. He had learned his craft from an elderly scribe who had trained him patiently, teaching precise letter formation and the careful attention required when copying important documents without error. Merchants relied upon him to record trading agreements, officials sought his careful hand for administrative correspondence, and families occasionally requested his services preparing personal letters to relatives scattered throughout the vast Roman world. Marcus took quiet pride in this trusted reputation, understanding accuracy mattered enormously within documents that carried real consequences. That particular season, trade had increased steadily through Alexandria's busy harbor, and Marcus found himself especially occupied, carefully copying shipping manifests, contracts, and correspondence between merchants conducting business across considerable distances. He worked methodically, his reed pen moving with practiced precision across smooth papyrus surfaces. His nephew, 16 years old, had begun apprenticing with him that season, gradually learning proper letter formation, absorbing patience that careful scribal work demanded above all else. Marcus taught steadily, remembering his own early struggles mastering consistent, legible handwriting decades before. In quieter afternoon hours, Marcus would sit near his window, reviewing completed documents carefully before delivery, catching small errors with practiced attention, understanding that even minor mistakes could create genuine confusion within important agreements. As evening settled over Alexandria's Roman quarter, Marcus would carefully store his prepared documents, cleaning his reed pens methodically, preparing everything for the following day's continued, demanding work. That night, resting peacefully within his modest home, Marcus felt quiet satisfaction in providing essential, trusted service. Tomorrow, he would return to his workshop, continuing careful, patient work that connected merchants and families across the vast, interconnected Roman world. The charcoal burner of Sila Forest. In the dense forests of ancient Bruttium in southern Italy, there lived a charcoal burner named Numerius Cassius Verrucosus, whose modest clearing deep within the Sila forest had produced charcoal for blacksmiths and households for nearly 31 years. His simple hut stood surrounded by tall pine and beech trees, smoke rising steadily from carefully built earthen mounds where wood slowly transformed into the essential fuel his community depended upon. Numerius was 59 years old, his hands and clothing permanently darkened with fine soot, his patience remarkable after decades spent carefully monitoring smoldering wood piles that required constant, watchful attention. He had learned this demanding trade from his father, who had taught him the precise techniques required to control fire's intensity, transforming ordinary timber into valuable charcoal without wasteful, uncontrolled burning. Blacksmiths throughout the region depended upon his steady production, understanding that quality charcoal burned hotter and more consistently than raw wood, essential for properly forging iron tools and weapons. Numerius took quiet pride in this recognition, understanding his solitary forest labor supported craftsmen throughout the surrounding towns and villages. That particular season, demand had increased steadily as blacksmiths prepared for busy planting season repairs, and Numerius found himself constructing several earthen mounds simultaneously, carefully monitoring each one's controlled burn throughout both day and night. He slept in brief intervals near his mounds, understanding that careless neglect could ruin days of careful preparation. His son, 22 years old, worked alongside him, gradually learning to read smoke color and intensity, absorbing patience this demanding, solitary trade required above all else. Numerius taught carefully, remembering his own early mistakes before gradually developing the watchful instincts his father had once possessed. In quieter moments between tending his mounds, Numerius would sit near his simple hut, listening to forest sounds surrounding his isolated clearing, birds calling gently while wind moved steadily through towering pine branches above. As evening settled deeper into the Sila forest, Numerius would check his mounds one final time before allowing himself brief rest, understanding his careful vigilance directly determined quality charcoal that ironworkers throughout the region depended upon completely. That night, resting briefly within his humble hut, Numerius felt quiet satisfaction in solitary, essential labor. Tomorrow, he would continue his careful, patient watch, sustaining blacksmiths and craftsmen throughout the countryside from his isolated forest home. The falconer of Cisalpine Gaul. In the fertile plains of ancient Cisalpine Gaul, north of the great river Po, there lived a falconer named Decimus Antonius Aquilinus, whose skilled hands had trained hunting birds for local landowners for nearly 27 years. His modest stone mews stood beside a quiet farmhouse, wooden perches lining the walls where several trained hawks and falcons rested calmly beneath his careful, patient watch. Decimus was 49 years old, his movements slow and deliberate whenever he approached his birds, understanding that hawks demanded genuine trust built through countless hours of patient, consistent handling. He had learned falconry from an old huntsman who had trained him gradually, teaching him to read subtle signs within a bird's posture and temperament long before he understood their deeper significance. Wealthy landowners throughout the region relied upon him to train birds for hunting hare and waterfowl across the plains' abundant marshlands, understanding that Decimus possessed rare patience required to properly develop a young hawk's natural abilities without breaking its essential wild spirit. He approached each bird individually, understanding none responded well to identical, rushed training. That particular season, he had acquired several young hawks captured from nearby hillsides, beginning the careful, gradual process of building trust through consistent feeding and quiet, patient handling. Decimus spent long hours simply sitting near his birds, allowing them to grow accustomed to his presence before attempting any actual training exercises. His young apprentice, a boy of 15, watched carefully during these sessions, gradually absorbing the remarkable patience falconry demanded, understanding that rushed training inevitably produced unreliable, poorly adjusted birds. Decimus taught steadily, remembering his own early impatience before eventually understanding genuine mastery required considerable time. In quieter afternoon hours, Decimus would walk his trained hawks along the riverside on his gloved arm, allowing them controlled flight before calling them back with practiced whistles, feeling deep satisfaction watching months of patient work finally producing genuine, trusting partnership between man and bird. As evening settled over the Cisalpine plains, Decimus would return his birds carefully to their perches, ensuring proper feeding before securing his mews for the night ahead. That night, resting peacefully within his modest home, Decimus felt quiet contentment in his rare, demanding craft. Tomorrow, he would return to his patient work, continuing the careful partnership between human patience and wild, magnificent creatures he had come to understand so intimately. The papyrus maker of Thebes. Along the fertile banks of the Nile River near ancient Thebes, there lived a papyrus maker named Senmut, whose modest workshop had transformed river reeds into writing material for nearly 28 years. His workshop stood close to the water's edge, bundles of freshly cut papyrus reeds drying beneath the warm Egyptian sun, their pale green stalks stacked carefully awaiting his patient, practiced hands. Senmut was 51 years old, his fingers calloused from decades spent slicing reed pith into thin strips, arranging them carefully in overlapping layers before pressing them together into smooth, usable sheets. He had learned this ancient craft from his father, who had taught him precise techniques passed down through countless generations along these same fertile riverbanks. Scribes throughout Thebes depended upon his careful work, understanding that Senmut produced papyrus sheets smooth and consistent enough for recording temple records, royal decrees, and the careful accounts that sustained Egypt's vast administrative system. He took quiet pride in this essential contribution, understanding his humble craft supported knowledge preserved across generations. That particular season, the Nile's flooding had proven generous, producing abundant reed growth along the riverbanks, and Senmut found himself especially busy, harvesting reeds each morning before the day's heat grew overwhelming. He worked methodically within his shaded workshop, slicing, arranging, and pressing with rhythm perfected across decades of careful practice. His son, 19 years old, worked alongside him, gradually learning the subtle pressure and timing required to produce properly bonded papyrus sheets, understanding that rushed work inevitably produced weak, unusable material. Senmut taught patiently, remembering his own father's careful instruction beside this same peaceful river years before. In quieter afternoon hours, Senmut would walk along the riverbank, watching fishing boats drift past, listening to distant sounds of temple ceremonies carried gently on warm afternoon air, feeling connected to the ancient rhythms that had sustained his family for generations upon this sacred river's edge. As evening settled over Thebes, golden light spreading across the wide, slow-moving Nile, Senmut would gather his day's finished papyrus sheets, storing them carefully before returning to his modest home nearby. That night, resting peacefully as cool evening air drifted from the river, Senmut felt deep satisfaction in preserving knowledge for generations yet to come. Tomorrow, he would return to his workshop, continuing patient, ancient work connecting him intimately to Egypt's timeless, flowing river. The Potter of Memphis. Along the western bank of the Nile near the ancient capital of Memphis, there lived a potter named Tehemhat, whose humble workshop had produced clay vessels for the surrounding community for nearly 30 years. His workshop stood beneath a simple palm-thatched roof, rows of drying pots arranged carefully upon wooden shelves, awaiting their turn within his small, sun-heated kiln. Tehemhat was 55 years old, his hands strong and steady from decades shaping wet river clay upon his simple spinning wheel, his eyes trained to recognize precisely when clay held perfect consistency for proper shaping. He had learned his craft from his father, who had taught him patience beside this same riverbank, understanding that clay rewarded gentle, confident handling rather than hurried force. Households throughout Memphis relied upon his sturdy vessels for storing grain, carrying water, and preserving oil and wine within their modest homes. Temple priests also sought his careful work, commissioning special vessels for ceremonial offerings, understanding that Tehemhat's reputation for quality craftsmanship had been earned across decades of consistent, honest work. That particular season, the annual Nile flood had deposited fresh, rich clay along the riverbank, and Tehemhat found himself especially busy, gathering material each morning before beginning his day's careful shaping. He worked steadily at his wheel, his foot maintaining rhythm below while his hands guided clay upward into familiar, practiced shapes. His daughter, 16 years old, had begun learning the craft that season, gradually understanding proper centering technique, absorbing patience that pottery demanded above all else. Tehemhat taught gently, remembering his own childhood spent watching his father's confident hands shape similar vessels decades before along this same peaceful river. In quieter afternoon hours, Tehemhat would sit near his kiln, monitoring careful firing, understanding that impatience could ruin days of careful shaping through improper heat control. Neighbors often stopped by, exchanging news while he continued his steady, attentive watch over the glowing kiln. As evening settled over Memphis, golden light reflecting gently across the wide Nile waters, Tehemhat would bank his kiln fire carefully, ensuring proper cooling through the peaceful night ahead. That night, resting quietly within his modest home, Tehemhat felt deep contentment in his ancient, steady craft. Tomorrow, he would return to his wheel, continuing patient work connecting him intimately to both his ancestors and the eternal, life-giving river flowing gently beside his beloved city. The Linen Weaver of Akhmim. In the town of Akhmim along the eastern bank of the Nile, there lived a linen weaver named Nofret, whose modest workshop had produced fine woven cloth for nearly 24 years. Her wooden loom stood beneath a shaded courtyard, flax thread stretched carefully across its frame, catching gentle morning light as she worked each day transforming humble fibers into cloth prized throughout the surrounding villages. Nofret was 45 years old, her fingers quick and sure from decades guiding thread through her loom, her eyes trained to notice even the slightest flaw within her careful, even patterns. She had learned weaving from her mother, who had taught her patience beside this same courtyard, understanding that fine linen required unhurried attention rather than rushed, careless work. Families throughout Akhmim depended upon her steady production for burial cloths, everyday garments, and the fine ceremonial linens used during religious festivals honoring the gods. Nofret took quiet pride in this recognition, understanding her careful craftsmanship connected ordinary households to traditions stretching back countless generations along the sacred river. That particular season, flax harvest had proven especially abundant following the Nile's generous annual flooding, and Nofret found herself especially busy, her loom's steady rhythm filling her courtyard from early morning until fading afternoon light made careful work increasingly difficult. She worked methodically, her hands moving through patterns perfected across decades of practiced repetition. Her daughter, 15 years old, sat beside her most afternoons, gradually learning the careful movements weaving required, absorbing patience her mother understood as essential to producing quality cloth. Nofret taught gently, remembering her own girlhood spent learning these same patient techniques from her mother years before. In quieter morning hours, before the day's demanding work fully began, Nofret would sit briefly watching the river beyond her courtyard wall, listening to distant sounds of fishing boats and temple ceremonies carried gently on warm morning air. Neighbors often visited during afternoon hours, exchanging news while Nofret's hands continued their steady rhythm, her attention comfortably divided between friendly conversation and the careful craft sustaining her family for generations. As evening settled over Akhmim, fading light making further weaving impossible, Nofret would carefully cover her loom until morning light returned once more. That night, resting peacefully within her modest home, Nofret felt deep satisfaction in patient, skilled work. Tomorrow, she would return to her loom, continuing steady labor connecting her intimately to both her ancestors and her beloved riverside community. The beekeeper of the Fayum Oasis. In the fertile Fayum Oasis west of the Nile, where irrigation canals wound gently between date palms and fig orchards, there lived a beekeeper named Amenhotep, whose rows of clay hives had produced honey for the surrounding villages for nearly 26 years. His modest farmstead stood near a quiet canal, the air filled each morning with the gentle hum of bees moving steadily between blossoming orchards. Amenhotep was 50 years old, his weathered hands calm and unhurried whenever he approached his hives, understanding bees required patience and gentle confidence rather than hurried, nervous movements. He had learned beekeeping from his father, who had kept hives along this same canal, teaching him careful techniques for calming bees using gentle smoke and slow, deliberate motion. Villages throughout the oasis depended upon his honey, valued not only for its sweetness but also for offerings made at local shrines and remedies used to treat wounds and coughs, knowledge passed down through generations of careful observation. Amenhotep took quiet pride in supplying this essential product, understanding his bees connected him meaningfully to his entire community's daily life. That particular season, the orchards had bloomed abundantly following a generous flood season, and Amenhotep found his hives producing honey in remarkable abundance. He spent long mornings among his clay hives, checking each one carefully, speaking softly to his bees just as his father had once taught him, believing the insects sensed calm and steady confidence. His son, 17 years old, had begun learning the craft that season, gradually overcoming his initial nervousness, developing the patient calm beekeeping demanded above all else. Amenhotep taught him gently, remembering his own early apprehension before understanding that bees rewarded genuine respect and quiet confidence. In the afternoons, Amenhotep extracted honey within a small shaded shelter, the air thick with sweetness, clay jars lining wooden shelves in careful rows. Village children often visited, drawn by curiosity and the promise of honey straight from the comb, watching wide-eyed as he worked calmly among his gently buzzing bees. As evening approached, golden light spreading across the oasis, the bees' hums softened gradually into stillness as they settled peacefully within their hives. Amenhotep would walk slowly homeward, his hands sticky with honey, his heart full of quiet satisfaction. That night, resting peacefully within his modest home, Amenhotep felt deeply connected to generations before him, grateful for patient, ancient work sustaining both his family and his beloved oasis community. The boat builder of Elephantine. On the island of Elephantine near the Nile's first cataract, there lived a boat builder named Conquest, whose modest workshop had constructed river vessels for nearly 32 years. His workshop stood close to the water's edge, wooden planks and reed bundles arranged carefully awaiting his patient, practiced hands, the steady sound of his tools mixing with the constant murmur of the river's current. Conquest was 56 years old, his hands strong and calloused from decades shaping timber and binding reed bundles into sturdy vessels capable of navigating the Nile's sometimes turbulent, sometimes gentle waters. He had learned his craft from his father, who had taught him precise techniques passed down through generations of boat builders settled upon this ancient river island. Merchants and fishermen throughout the region depended upon him completely, understanding that Conquest constructed vessels sturdy enough to withstand the Nile's shifting currents and the demanding trade routes stretching toward distant southern lands. He approached each boat with careful seriousness, selecting materials personally, understanding that lives depended entirely upon vessels built with genuine, unhurried care. That particular season, trade traffic had increased steadily as merchants prepared vessels for journeys carrying grain, stone, and goods between Elephantine and towns further downstream. Conquest worked long hours alongside his small crew, shaping hull planks with practiced precision, understanding each binding required careful attention to ensure lasting strength against the river's steady pressure. His son, 21 years old, worked steadily beside him, gradually mastering techniques passed down through generations, understanding true craftsmanship required years of patient practice before genuine confidence emerged naturally. Conquest taught carefully, remembering his own early uncertainty before slowly developing the steady skill his father had once possessed. In quieter evening hours, after his crew departed for the day, Conquest would walk along completed vessels resting near the shore, admiring craftsmanship that would soon carry travelers safely along the ancient river, feeling quiet pride in work built to endure demanding journeys. As evening settled over Elephantine, boats gently rocking against the current, Conquest would secure his workshop carefully, walking homeward through streets filled with the mingled scents of river water and fresh-cut timber. That night, resting peacefully within his modest home, listening to the familiar sound of the Nile flowing steadily nearby, Conquest felt the deep satisfaction of work directly tied to travelers' safety, continuing patient craft connecting him intimately to the timeless river sustaining his entire community.